Good evening. You're listening to Whispers of Time, where the past drifts by slowly enough to fall asleep to. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and let history become your lullaby. If you enjoy calm stories told softly, subscribe now so you don't miss the next quiet journey through time. The sea was a mirror of iron, grey and merciless. The wind sheared across the decks of the longship Hrafn's Wing, swirling snow and spray together in a frozen mist. No lanterns glowed inside, no hearths burned. On this voyage, fire would be a death trap. Leifa Stormhand stood at the prow, cloak heavy with frost, his breath misting in the cold air. Around him, his shipmates crouched beneath the hull's low arches, wrapped in furs pressing close to the timbers. The night was long, the dark deeper than they had ever travelled. "How long, Captain?" asked Svanhild, leaning over the rail, her voice thin with cold. Leifa glanced at her, then at the horizon. "We keep course north. When the ice clears, we find land. Hours, maybe a day." He spat salt and spittle into the sea. He was reluctant to promise anything more. They had left the fjords weeks ago to hunt the whale routes to find new water, or trade along distant coasts. But the sea had shifted on them, ice moving south in unexpected ridges, storms pushing them off course. Their supplies were dwindling, the men were cold to the bone, the ship creaked, the timbers sang their complaint. Leifa pressed a hand to the wood. It was raw and biting. He knew the rumours, that some longships used hidden stoves or caches of charcoal, but none of that had ever been found in the hulls excavated in grave ships. Archaeologists had concluded Vikings at sea often travelled without fire aboard. YouTube. The reason was simple. Fire in a wooden shell surrounded by wind and spray was too dangerous. And so, crews endured cold with ingenuity, solidarity and luck. Leifa turned to the men. "Huddle against the keel timbers. Tie yourselves down if you must. Do not move unless needed. Save body heat. We survive by silence and patience." Men shifted and curled. The wind whistled through planks. The prow sliced through waves that broke in icy foam. No one spoke much, only the drip of melting snow from the ropes above and the whisper of the sea. That night a crack startled Leifa awake, a sharp snap from below. The hull shuddered. In the dim cold he saw one of the planks had split under stress, letting a trickle of icy water in. Quickly several men scrambled. They used pitch, oakum, seal fat, whatever they had, to patch the breach. Their hands were raw, lips cracked, minds sharp from fatigue. When it was done, Leifa pressed his forehead against the wood, the cold seeping through. The men looked at him with hollow eyes. No fire. The only warmth they would have was their bodies pressed together and the faint heat they forced into themselves. 2. The drift. By sunrise the ice had thickened. Floes of broken pack ice drifted past like great white beasts in the sea. The ship crept through narrow lanes of brine. The spray froze on shields, oars and ship rails, forming a crystalline crust. Each gale threatened to freeze the rigging solid. Svanhild stood near Leifa, pulling her fur hood tighter. "Captain, we see rock ahead. Dark cliff through the ice fog." He turned. Yes. A black ledge emerged, rising above the cold sea. Land. Maybe a narrow isle. Maybe the northern shore. A chance to rest, to make dry. He nodded. "We make for it. We careen the ship, dry sails, find shelter, but stay alert. Ice shifts." They anchored in a sheltered cove, boards creaking as the hull ground slightly. Strong men waded into shallow, frigid water, dragging the ship onto rock and gravel. The deck pitched, then rested. Leifa led a small party ashore, Svanhild among them, and Ivar the Quiet, a hawk-eyed tracker. They climbed the cliff to get vantage. The land was stark. Snow-smeared rock, skeletal pines, shallow caves. No smoke, no sign of settlement. But they found old stones in a circle, a makeshift altar of sorts. Ivar knelt by them. "Ancient runes," he whispered. "Non-Christian, no longer read by many." Svanhild laid a gloved hand on a stone. "We are not welcome if one still watches." Leifr nodded. They returned to the ship, wary. That night, they set watches in pairs. No fire. Each pair curled tightly, back to back, exchanging warmth and watching the dark. The silence pressed heavy. In the dead hours, Leifr insisted on walking the deck. He pressed his ear to the keel. The sea murmured. The ice ground. The wind moaned. He thought he heard voices, faint, echoing, but the cold tricked ears, perhaps just the crash of distant flow. He looked to the dim horizon and uttered a prayer to Odin and Njord both. "Keep us unseen, let this night pass." Thrud. The frozen storm morning came, pale and brittle. The sea slush rattled against the hull. A line of dark clouds gathered in the distance. The crew braced. Leifr sensed storm. By midday the storm broke. Wind lashed the ship. Ice hammered the planks. The sea rose in sharp crests. The Raffin's wing groaned under strain. Without fire, the crew had no refuge. They were exposed. Leifr ordered all hands to lash themselves. Oars were stowed or lashed. The sail furled. The ship turned bow into wind. Waves smashed, soaking the deck. Ice built up again. Men fought to keep the hull from capsizing. Ropes snapped. Svanhild nearly went overboard, but Ivar caught her. Leifr shouted through the din, "Hold fast! Ride it out!" Hours passed as a blur. The storm raged. The ship's timbers flexed ominously. The hull threatened to crack at seams. Outside, the world was white noise and fury. When the wind died at last, the sea was shattered shards of ice. The ship was battered. Some oars lost. The crew exhausted, soaked, frozen, but alive. Leifr assessed damage. Many boards had loosened. The patch from the first night had shifted. They had to make repairs immediately. They beached the ship again in a shallow bay, using every hand to drag her on rocks. Men collapsed. Some wept from cold and fear. Svanhild knelt beside one, tearing her cloak to wrap around him. Leifr set men to patchwork, hammering oakum, fibres, re-reeve planks, bracing ribs. Night came heavy and starless. They had no fire. They huddled inside the half-shelter of the hull, pressed together. Their teeth chattered. Their voices faded. They spoke only in whispers or not at all. Leifr closed his eyes but could not sleep. He heard the wind outside, felt the presence of ice and sea. He thought of distant hearths, of warm halls, of home. He wondered how many nights more the men would endure. The search for warmth. As dawn broke, the sky worked through shades of pewter. They had to move, lest the ice trap them forever. Repairs enough to make the ship seaworthy. They launched again. The hull groaned, the oars splashed. They found open leads through the floes. Their spirits were brittle. Leifr called the crew together on deck. "Men," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have endured fireless nights, storms, ice, but we sail yet. We must find land with shelter. Somewhere there may be hot springs, caves, fumaroles. We must reach them while we can." They nodded, lean faces hard with hunger and cold. At Ivar's direction, they kept toward the headlands, skirting ice walls and tracking gull flights. On the fourth evening, the lookout shouted. Smoke, faint but real, rising beyond a distant ridge. They veered toward it. That night they camped close by in sheltered caves. Leifr led a small party under cover of dusk up the ridge. There they found a hot spring, steaming and small, feeding a trickle of warm water down the rock face. The air above the spring flickered with mist. He sent word to the crew. Men came, careful, cautious. They drew water, warmed their hands, soaked cold limbs. They used heated stones, gathering rocks from near the spring, to warm hull planks from below, to warm their bodies. This was the first real heat since departure. They built faux fireplaces outside the hull, rings of stone to hold hot coals and rock warmed by the steam. They did not bring flame aboard, but they created zones of warmth ashore. Svanhild and others brewed thin broth, using shellfish and seaweed scavenged nearby. The heat revived bones. The men's voices came back. Laughter cracked, hoarse but there. They dried garments near the stream steam, mended sails, and dried wood for emergency use. They stayed 2 nights, gathering strength. Leifa knew that continuing north would be easier for a few but riskier in harsh seas. The land suggested a path inland, valleys that might lead to fjords or habitable coasts. They plotted a course, the Inland Passage. With supplies bolstered and spirits warmed, the Hafenswing was dragged for part of the route across ice and shallow channels. For others, rowed through narrow rivers. The men walked on land where possible, dragging the ship over sled rails. Their progress was slow, painful, but steady. The inland route brought them through narrow valleys dusted with snow. Rocky walls rose steep. Frozen waterfalls hung like veils. They crossed small ridges and low passes. Wolves watched from dark forests. The crew kept arms ready. At day's end, they found an abandoned hermitage. A small stone building, roof partly collapsed, a hearth cold but intact, a chimney open to sky. They lit a small fire there, as a one-time refuge not aboard ship. The flue channeled smoke, the stone hearth held heat. They dried furs, warmed bones, roused strength for the final leg. They left the fire minimal, extinguished fully before departure, wary of smoke drifting to watchers. By the 10th day inland, signs of civilization appeared. Distant lights, smoke, distant voices. At dawn, their scouts returned with news. Coastal settlement ahead, a small outpost of fishermen, friendly of cautious types. The ice had receded enough for ship's passage again. Heartened, the crew rowed toward that final horizon. The sea slipped beneath them, open, forgiving. The last miles were merciful. 6. Returned to civilization. They rounded a cape at dawn and saw the settlement. Wooden huts, smoke rising, ships in small harbour. As they approached, inhabitants looked on. Odd ghostly forms at sea come to land. Leifa ordered sails lowered and rowed in. At the harbour dock, children cried out. Fisherfolk rushed out, weapons and nets both in hand, wary. Leifa raised his hand in greeting. "We are travellers," he said, "friends. We seek trade, warmth, rest." The harbour master, a tall, weathered man with sea-smoked skin, studied them. Leifa disembarked, followed by Svanhild and Ivar. They walked across snow and wet planks. The man asked, "No fires aboard?" He looked at the frozen ship, at men in furs. "You have no flame on board?" Leifa shook his head. "We sailed fireless across the ice. Too dangerous otherwise." The harbour master's eyes widened. "Never heard of that. But you are welcome. Our hearths are warm." They were led to a longhouse close by. Inside, a fire burned high. Bread warmed, fish roasted. The smell struck like life. Men fell to floor and ate, laughing through tears. Wounds were bandaged, sores cleaned. Warm broth replaced stale rations. That night, Leifa stood at the longhouse entrance, watching the wind outside. Svanhild joined him. "You kept us alive," she said softly. He placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. "We survived. Together." She looked at his face, stiff with fatigue, eyes shadowed. "Will you ever travel this way again?" He turned to the sea beyond the light. "Maybe, but not without preparation. Fireless or not, a man must learn to respect both flame and ice." Less. Epilogue. The legacy of fireless voyages. In time, Leifa and his crew stayed at the settlement a season, trading fish, furs, and stories of a sea where ships carried no fire. They told of their techniques, huddling, patching, using hot springs, safe harbours, care and patience. Travellers from distant coasts came to hear, to learn how one might cross icy seas without burning a ship. Leifa carved a memorial on a stone near the old harbour, a raven with wings spread, flanked by waves and runes, meaning "to those who endure the cold without fire." Fishermen who passed the stone would touch it for luck. He made diaries about the journey, notes on seams, drafts, ice flow, the hours of night, the care of men, the rituals to keep morale. He taught young sailors that the sea is a harsh teacher, but that humility and cunning allowed survival where brute force failed. The memory of the fireless voyage spread, in coastal sagas, in whispered tales over hearths, in the wisdom passed to captains who sailed cold waters. Some doubted, Some claimed the men had hidden stoves or secret foibles, but the bones of the Hrafn's wing lay in a small graveyard near the settlement, ribs exposed to salt and wind, a reminder that the greatest voyages sometimes require neither flame nor glory, but endurance and modest hope. Lifa, older now, would sit by the hearth in that longhouse, a mug of broth in his hands, watching the flames flicker. He would remember the nights of ice and the silence aboard ship. Sometimes he would step outside into the cold, glance at the sea, and whisper thanks to the silent gods who sustained them without fire. And when he died, they buried him beneath the Ravenstone and the sea claimed his name. But sailors still tell of the voyage, of crossing the icy sea without fire, and of Lifa Stormhand, the captain who taught that flame is not always the measure of life, and that a ship and crew can survive on courage, care, and cunning. The sea was iron that night, black, sharp, and merciless. The prow of Frost Serpent rose and crashed through the waves like a wounded beast, its carved dragon head spitting salt and foam. The winter wind shrieked across the open water, tearing at sails stiff with ice. Every plank groaned, every rope screamed, and the men, those who still stood, shouted prayers to gods who no longer answered. Eric Wolfeye gripped the tiller with hands cracked from frost. His cloak was heavy with sea spray, his beard frozen into white strands that glittered like blades. Around his neck hung a wolf's tooth, dark and polished smooth by years of wear. His eyes, one pale grey, one the colour of old bronze, glinted in the dim light of the storm. "Hold her steady!" he roared, his voice cutting through the wind like an axe. A man stumbled across the deck toward him. It was Bjorn the Younger, the last helmsman still alive from the voyage that had begun 3 weeks ago in the green fjords of Norway. "She's breaking apart, Captain," Bjorn cried, the mast splitting and the men— "Then lash it with your guts if you must," Eric snarled. "We're not dying in the belly of the sea." Lightning split the horizon, revealing walls of water higher than the tallest longhouse. For a heartbeat, Eric saw them. 12 men still living, ghosts among the dead. Their faces were white with cold, their eyes wild, their gods silent. The sea came again, hammering the Frost Serpent into the deep. For a moment, Eric felt the ship's ribs shudder beneath his boots, like a dying animal gasping its last breath. Then, through the roaring dark, he saw it. Land, a jagged line of black rock through the snow, like the spine of a sleeping dragon. The gods had thrown them one last chance. 2. The Shore of Bones. They made landfall by miracle and madness. The Frost Serpent, half broken, slammed onto the stony beach. Men leapt into the freezing shallows, dragging ropes, hauling their ship from the sea's grasp. The storm howled behind them, furious that they had escaped. When at last the wind died, silence fell heavy as a burial shroud. Eric stood upon the shore, staring into the white void of the storm's aftermath. Snow drifted from the sky like ash. Around him the survivors, ragged, frost-bitten, hollow-eyed, knelt in exhaustion. 2 men were dead, frozen upright beside the ship. Eirik drew his axe and drove it into the sand beside them, murmuring a prayer to Odin and Njord. Bjorn came to his side. "Where are we, Eirik?" Eirik scanned the coastline. "Somewhere north of Vestland, perhaps beyond. The gods have cast us where they will." The younger man nodded but did not speak. They both knew what lay ahead: hunger, cold, and the long walk home through snow and betrayal. Eric turned his eyes inland. Far beyond the shore, through a veil of mist, he saw smoke rising, thin and pale. A settlement, civilization, or something worse. 3. The Hall of Ravens. 2 days later, they reached the village of Hrafnhall, the Hall of Ravens. It lay at the end of a frozen fjord surrounded by black pine and cliffs slick with ice. The hall itself was vast, its roof carved with the wings of ravens, its gate bound with runes of protection and warning. But Eirik felt no welcome there. They were met by men with spears, guards of the local Jarl. When Eric gave his name, a murmur passed through them like wind through reeds. "The Wolfeye returns," one said. "But does he return as hero or ghost?" Inside the hall, Warmth struck him like a hammer. Fires burned in long pits, smoke curling toward rafters thick with soot. Warriors drank from horns, women served roasted meat and ale, and laughter echoed like the sound of our axes. At the far end of the hall sat Jarl Hakon, lord of these lands, grey-bearded, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp as the sea. But it was not him that Eric's gaze found first. It was Sigurvald, his sworn brother. Once the shield at his side, now seated beside the Jarl, wearing a cloak of silver wolf fur, Eric's own prize from the raids of the east, and beside him, Astrid, daughter of Hakon, once the flame of Eric's youth. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but she said nothing. Eric's heart turned to stone. 4. The Feast of Lies. The Jarl rose, smiling the thin smile of a man who smells of secrets. Eric Wulfeye, Hakon said, voice booming through the hall. Son of the North Winds, you have returned from the dead. I never left, Eric replied. The sea tried to claim me, but I bit its hand. Laughter rippled through the hall, though it did not reach every mouth. Sigurvald's especially. Sit, brother, said Sigurvald, rising, spreading his arms. You look half a corpse already. We thought you gone these past winters. Your ship vanished near the Isles of Finnmark. Eric sat slowly, his axe laid across his knees. The dead don't eat, he said, and I'm hungry. Meat was brought, ale poured, horns raised. But beneath the laughter a quiet unease stirred. Eric noticed it in glances, in whispers that ceased when he passed, in the way Sigurvald avoided his gaze. He ate little. He watched. And when the Jarl spoke of his daughter's betrothal to Sigurvald the Bold, something inside Eric snapped like frozen oak. Astrid could not meet his eyes. Her hands trembled as she poured ale into Sigurvald's horn. So that was the truth of it. The feast burned on. Men sang, women laughed. The smell of roasted boar filled the air. But Eric heard only the crackle of betrayal in the fire. When the night was nearly done, he rose. To the sea, he said, raising his horn, and to the men it takes, and the ones it should have. Sigurvald's smile faltered for just an instant. Then the hall roared in laughter again, and Eric left into the snow. V. The Whisper of Knives. That night sleep fled him. He stood on the cliffs above Hrafn Hall, the sea crashing below. Snow fell thick, muffling the world. Behind him, unseen in the white dark, footsteps whispered. He turned. 3 shadows moved toward him, slow, deliberate, blades in hand. One he recognized, Sigurvald's man, Olaf the Crooked. Another, a stranger with a scar like lightning down his cheek. So this is how the bold greet their brothers, Eric said. No answer came, only steel. The fight was short and brutal, axes flashing, snow flying, blood steaming in the cold air. When it was done, 2 men lay dead. The third crawled away, leaving red upon white. Eric knelt beside the body of Olaf and found what he expected, a coin stamped with Hakon's mark, the Jarl's seal, payment for murder. He looked toward the dark village below, then up, toward the frozen stars. So it begins, he whispered. Sick, the Oath of Frost. At dawn, Eric gathered his men, those few who had survived the sea, Bjorn the Younger, Torfi the Black, old Rurik with his half-hand. They stood in the snow outside the ship where ravens pecked at the bodies of last night's would-be assassins. Eric said nothing for a time. Then, "We are hunted in our own land. Our names are marked. Hakon and Sigurvald have made us ghosts." "What now, Captain?" Bjorn asked. Eric looked north, where the mountains vanished into mist. "There are tales," he said slowly, "of an island beyond the storms, Frostheim. They say the ancients built a hall of ice there, and in its heart lies a stone that beats, the heart of the north. Whoever holds it cannot be broken." Rurik spat. "Old wives' tales." "Maybe," Eric said, "but I would rather chase a ghost than kneel to a traitor." The men were silent. The wind howled across the shore. Then Bjorn nodded. "Aye, Captain, if we must die, Let it be seeking glory, not forgiveness." Eric smiled, the first true smile in weeks. "Then gather what's left. We sail at dusk." Above them the ravens cried, harsh, hungry, prophetic. The day that followed was a blur of movement and small, desperate necessities. Eric moved through the village like a shadow that had grown accustomed to the cold. He took what he could from the longhouse storerooms, lengths of rope, strips of leather, spare iron. He traded a coin or two for salted fish from a woman who recognized his face and had once been the wife of a man he had saved in a raid. He did not ask for favors. He had long since learned that debts hung heavier than steel. The survivors worked with a grim efficiency. Torfi the Black set to mending the sail with hands numb from frost, stitching with a needle that had once sewn banners. Rurik, who had lost his hand in a fight with a cliff troll years ago, sharpened his remaining blade on a stone until the metal sang. Bjorn replated the rigging. Between two breaths and the heavy sound of the tide, he told low jokes to keep his hands from shaking. Word passed like smoke through the hall. The captain, who had returned from death, sought men for one more voyage, not for coin alone, but for blood and binding. A few joined. Runaways, men with no claim and no hearth, or those who already had one foot in the grave. They came with eyes that asked little, and did not expect mercy. Among them walked a lanky youth named Halvard, both eager and terrified, a woman in a fur-lined tunic who called herself Ingrid, whose right arm bore the faded mark of a midwife, and a silent, broad-shouldered man called Jan, whose laugh came seldom and only when the ale burned his throat. Eric made no promises he could not keep. He would teach them to navigate the white teeth of the northern seas, and when the time came he would carve retribution from the bone of their enemies. That evening, before dusk drank the last of the light, Eric climbed once more to the cliffs where the sea hammered itself to dust. He watched Traffenhall below, the smoke of its chimneys curling into the early night like nervous fingers. He tasted salt and iron and the ash of a burned hope. He had not yet told the men of the coin he had found in Olaf's hand. Secrets are slow echoes that shape deeds. He kept it folded like a blade beneath his tunic. He had not yet told them of Astrid's gaze and the way it had turned away, nor of Sigervald's laugh that had been coated with honey and sawdust. Those things were heavy, and a leader must measure weight before setting foot onto thin ice. When he returned to the ship, he found Bjorn staring at the sea as though it might speak his name. "Do you think we'll find Frostheim?" the helmsman asked. Eric shrugged. There were stories and there were facts. Frostheim sat somewhere in between, like a whisper half-remembered. "Stories are how men keep from freezing to death," he said, "but I have sailed to islands that should not be on any chart. The world is bigger than the maps carved by fear." Bjorn chewed on that and spat into the water. They ate badly that night. Dried fish and a scrap of bread. Men slept with axes within arm's reach. The sky offered a million thin stars. They looked like teeth. Outside, the sea murmured, thinking of ruin. Furris Astrid in the mirror. Eric had not expected Astrid to come. He had expected at most a glance and then the closing of a door. But as the men slept fitfully in shifts, there she was, pale as milk and wrapped in furs, standing at the prow. He should have been ashamed that a man hardened by cold and death could remember a woman as flame. Shame and nostalgia were two different kinds of frost, and both could take a man's core. "Astrid," he said quietly. She did not startle. She had the hardened composure of a woman who has learned to hold a hearth against winter winds. Yet her eyes were red-rimmed, and the breath between them fogged in the cold. "You should not have come," Eric said. "They will whisper you to a spear point if you're seen." "I could say the same of you," she replied. "Or perhaps it is where you have stood all along." She stepped closer, the fur whipping like a banner. For a moment the ocean filled with the sound of nothing but the creak of the ship. Astrid reached for his hand, but did not take it. "I did not ask for Sigervald," she said, fingers limned by shame. "My father ordered it. Blood and oath. He says our hold will be stronger if allied with Odin's favoured. But Hakon also speaks with the Jarl of the South. They offered him trade, silver and men." "You were promised like a stallion," Eric said. Hakon bartered you for strength he does not yet own. Astrid's face hardened. Do you think I wished it? Do you think desire counts when lineage is a ledger? She looked at him then with something like accusation. You left. It was the sea, he said. It took me. The sea also gives, she said. It gives and it takes. We all trade in what it asks. Eric searched her face for the girl he once knew, the one who had darted across the Longhouse Green with laughter. He found a woman who had been braided and burned by duty. For every year he had been at war, she had been bound by obligations that felt like manacles. I will not take you with me, Eric said, because he could not, and because men who love must sometimes be cowardly. I do not ask you to flee your blood. I only ask that you remember, should I return, you will know my hand and not Sigurvald's. Her fingers tightened a fraction. If you break Hakon, there will be no home for me, she whispered. If you die seeking a stone, then the man who sits at my father's side will call me his wife, and I will be a shadow in his hall. Eric wanted to tell her that she could be more than a shadow, that he would build a new hall on his return. But the lies of a hope are too fragile in a world where a coin can buy a man's murder. Then when I return, he said at last, I will give you choice. If I fail, then let the cold keep me. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, as if for warmth and for a last memory. The murmur of the sea held them both like a lullaby. It also promised nothing. When she left, she looked back once more. In that look there was fear and a plea and a light that would not be stifled, like a lantern in a doorway. Nigh, the loose thread. The voyage north was slow and mean. The men wore their courage like an extra layer, but it frayed. Days on the sea smeared together in a charcoal wash, the lurch of the ship, the hiss of the wind, the bitter tang of salt on their tongues. The food dwindled. The fish refused to come. They dropped anchor in a small cove once and stole goat from a cliffside farm, leaving a coin and a curse. Another night Torfi nearly died from a fever that made him see the faces of his dead kin, as if they were watching him from the water. Rurik told stories of giant serpents that had once eaten whole ships, and the men laughed until the laugh turned to coughing. Sigurvald's name did not leave Eirik's head. It moved like an ember, hot and small, threatening to lay everything in ash. He tried to be a captain for his men. He mapped their rations, he kept watch in the night, he guided their course by stars he could name. But leadership is a constant arithmetic of promises and consequences. For every direction he offered, he had to burn another option. It was Halvard who found the loose thread that would unravel other things. They had stopped at a small skerry to dry their sails. The sun was a pale coin in the sky, and gulls cried like old women. Halvard had gone above to gather stray ropes when he heard a clatter below, the sound of leather against wood. He called out, and Torfi answered with a curse. Halvard returned to the hold with a scrap of canvas that had been stitched into a cloak, and stitched badly, in a hand that did not understand the careful geometry of a sailor's seam. On the cloak was a sigil, a small mark that Eric recognized at a glance. It was the Jarl Hakon's rune, a sign used to mark men in his service. It was cleanly sewn, the way a man marks his field. Eric sat on a wooden chest and turned the cloth between his hands. Sweat chilled along his spine. The world had a measure to it. This was proof. The Jarl had sent henchmen. The hall had bartered in promises and hired knives. You kept this from us, Bjorn said. I did not want to be certain, Eirik said. If I am to be hunted, I wanted it to be by a ghost and not by a known face. Rurik spat upon the deck. Then let us be known faces to them. Let them meet us with swords when they come. Eric sealed the finding with a nod, but inside his mind the rope of decisions tightened. They could sail back and storm Raffenhall and cut Sigurvald down where he sat at the Jarl's side. They could call upon other Jarls and drag the traitors into the light. Those were good and simple answers, like the edge of an axe, but they were not possible. He had a crew of men weary from the sea and a hunger that clamoured like iron. More than that, there was the problem of Astrid. She lay inside the web of political marriages like an egg in a nest. To kill Hakon was to uproot a forest. To slay Sigurvald without a plan was to hand power to another who might be worse. "What do you want, Captain?" Halvard asked, young and raw. "Do we go back and burn them, or do we steal their hearts and leave them without breath?" Eric looked at the boy and thought of the ocean he would have to cross if they turned back. "We do neither," he said at last. "We are not yet wolves with enough teeth to bring down a bear. We will find Frostheim. If the stone is true, it will tip the balance. If it is false, then at least we will have been given a chance to prove the traitors wrong by our own hands." Bjorn spat again, and this time it was not from anger, but from the relief of someone who finds a handle when he thought only to fall. "Then we sail." X, the grey latitude. They pushed north toward a latitude where the world began to lose its colour. The sky became a ceiling of grey, and the horizon was a flat line of possible doom. Days were shorter, light was a rumour. Seabirds migrated in strange triangles, and then vanished into the grey. The water grew colder and more unwelcoming. Frost crept along the rail like an old friend contorting into claws. When the ice first came, it was playful, small discs drifting like coins, easy to poke aside with a plank. The men laughed then, a brittle sound like glass. They sang halting verses, songs that spoke of home and horns and the bite of a dead man's ale. But the ice changed its face in a day. It gathered into sheets, then packed into floes that rolled like a living thing. The frost serpent groaned as it pushed through. The oars felt heavier, each stroke like pulling a stone through the sea. They followed a lead, a river of open water cutting through the ice that stretched like a wound across the white. For days they tracked it, slipping deeper into the north where maps whispered to themselves and gods were quiet because they were afraid. Halvard, new and eager, watched the ice with a kind of childlike wonder that some might call hope. Eirik watched it the way his grandfather had taught him to see wolves, not as enemies only, but as indicators of the land. Where they hunted, there was game. Where they avoided, there was danger. On the fourth night of the ice, a sound woke the men, a low, resonating note that seemed to come from the ice itself. It was not wind nor the creak of timber. It was older, animal and metal interwoven, a bell rung underwater by a hand that understood sorrow. Rurik's eyes were wide. "The stones hum," he whispered, and his breath fogged. "The old stones hum when a place remembers." Eric stood at the prow and listened. The sound moved through bone. It made the teeth chatter even when men were settled upon their beds of fur. He felt it under his feet, through the wood, through the marrow. "Keep watch," he ordered. "Tomorrow we push further." No one spoke of fear. It was understood. Fear was a fine thing, but not a map. 1 Bice. The Omen and the Seal, just before dawn, under a sky that had forgotten blue, they found it, the first sign that the world still believed in omens. A seal lay upon the nearest floe. It was enormous, its skin the pale colour of old bone, its whiskers thick as twigs, its eyes were shuttered with ice. But the strange thing was not the seal itself. It was the circle of black stones arranged around it on the ice. Men rarely arranged stones this way in places where no man had hands to hold them. The mound smelled faintly of smoke, as if a small fire had been lit and then suffocated. Eric knelt and touched a stone. The feel was like pressing a palm to an old wound. In the centre of the circle there was a small wooden effigy, a carved figure of a man with antlers like a stag. The face had been worn away by wind. A strip of leather bound it where a heart might have been. No blood stained the ice. There was only the seal, mute and vast, and the faint char of an offering. Rurik, whose faith in signs was deeper than his faith in coin, crossed himself. "A gift to the old ones," he murmured. "Someone here asks for favour." Eric picked up the effigy. It was light but not trivial. It had the sort of weight that rumours carry. He smelled peat and old smoke. His thumb found a rune crudely carved into the base, a mark he had seen before on a traveller's club, the kind pilgrims wore. It was not Hakon's mark nor Sigurvald's. It was something older than Jarl or law. "This was left by men," he said. "Not by giants nor by the sea." Bjorn ducked his head. Maybe they came before us and made a road to the hall. Eric placed the effigy back and drew a small circle in the snow, the way a man might trace the edge of a cup. "We take nothing that is not ours," he said. "If we are to ask the Old Ones for help, we will do it with clean hands." It was a small thing, courtesy to spirits, but men see what they need when they are scared. The day felt thinner after that, like a cloth worn too long. The sea opened into a wider channel, and ahead a black wall rose like the back of something enormous. Beyond it the fog boiled. It swallowed sound. Eric ordered sails hoisted and the men to their posts. The frost serpent pressed forward, cutting into the unknown with a prow that had seen too many winters and not one dawn. Satentguld, the first light of Frostheim. By noon the fog broke like a bad memory. The world returned to a sort of simple clarity, a horizon, a sound, a direction. And then they saw it, a smudge at first against the white, then a cliff, then the outline of an island that had the logic of ruins. Frostheim stood like a thing remembered from a child's nightmare. Jagged cliffs rimed with ice, towers of black volcanic stone capped with glaciers, and along the shore the skeletons of ships from seasons ago. There was a musk, a bitter scent of stone and old wood that made the throat close. The island's silhouette was broken by arches and the ragged remains of walls. On one promontory, a place that might once have been a hall stuck upward like a rib. Eric felt the breath leave his chest and come back with a new steadiness. The men on deck hushed, as if not to wake something ancient. "Is that Frostheim?" Halvard said. Eric did not answer with words. He only watched as gulls wheeled and something black, a raven huge as a man, took flight from a nearby spire. It circled once and then dropped toward the sea, where something like a shape moved beneath the waves. He felt the old hunger sharpen, not for flesh, but for the truth. If the heart of the North was a thing, then it likely sat within those walls. If it was a lie, then it would not be the first one he had followed. But tales had a way of being more true on the edges of the world. He ordered the men to make fast near a sheltered cove, where jagged black rocks would protect them from the worst of the wind. Men moved like ghosts sewn to the deck, their shadows long and trembling. Torfi let out a sound that might have been a prayer. Rurik crossed himself and spat for luck. As they rowed the last few strokes to shore, Eric felt something else settle. The knowledge that once they set foot on that island, there would be no easy way back. Frostheim kept what it was owed. He stepped onto the black sand last, his axe at his hip, the wolf's tooth heavy against his chest. Behind him the frost serpent tugged at the ropes like a beast unsure of where to sleep. The cliff wind carried a tone like a bell, and from somewhere within the island a faint light pulsed, rhythmical and slow, like the beat of a heart. Eric placed his boot on the shore and felt the cold run up through his bones. He looked to his men, Bjorn, Torfi, Rurik, Halvard, Ingrid, Jarn, and for a moment their faces were young again, or at least they held the kind of courage a man shows when he chooses his own death. "Come," Eric said, "where the old stones remember, we will go and ask them what is owed." They moved together into the white and dark, toward the heart of the island and the promise of answers. Behind them, the sea rolled upon the beach and withdrew, as if to listen. The great hall of Jorvikheim stood like a beast of oak and smoke, its roof heavy with the scent of mead, roasted boar, and wet furs. Men shouted, laughed, slammed their cups on the long tables. The fire crackled, throwing sparks high into the rafters where ancient shields and skulls hung like forgotten gods. Eric Wolfeye entered through the heavy doors dripping with melted frost, the sea still clinging to his beard. The chatter dimmed. Faces turned, some smiled, others not. He saw his brother by oath, Sigurvald Ehrenhand, sitting at the high table beside Jarl Harald, who had once been Eric's father in arms. Sigurvald's face was freshly shaven, his hair bound in a braid of gold. A strange ring glittered on his hand, Harald's old signet. "By Odin's beard," someone muttered, "he lives." Eric's boots echoed as he strode down the hall. "Is this how heroes are greeted now?" he growled, half a grin curling on his lips. "With silence?" Harold rose slowly from his seat. His once broad shoulders seemed smaller now, his eyes colder. "We thought you lost," he said, voice heavy with caution. "Your ship was broken on the western seas." "And yet," Eric said, "the Norns refused to cut my thread." Laughter erupted among a few old comrades, Bjorn, Torsten, Runa, faces he trusted, but others looked away, whispering behind horns of ale. Then Eric saw her, Astrid, daughter of Harold, the woman whose smile had once pulled him from madness after the war in the West. Her gaze met his for an instant, soft, trembling, full of something that was not joy. Guilt, maybe. His chest tightened. They feasted late into the night, but the air was not the same. Eirik could feel the change. Like the sea before a storm, Sigrvald laughed too loudly. Harold spoke little. Astrid never looked at him again. When the meat was gone and the hall grew dim, Sigrvald raised his cup. "To the dead who did not return," he said, "and to those who should have stayed that way." The laughter that followed cut sharper than any blade. Eric's hand tightened on his horn. "Say your meaning plain, brother." Sigrvald leaned forward, his voice sweet with venom. "We all lost men in the West, but you lost something more, didn't you? Faith, loyalty, perhaps even honour." A murmur ran through the hall. Harold frowned but said nothing. Eric rose. The bench scraped beneath him. "Careful with your tongue," he said quietly, "or I'll take it and feed it to the dogs." Sigrvald smiled thinly. Still the beast, even after death. They stared at each other for a heartbeat too long, the whole hall holding its breath, until Harold slammed his cup down. "Enough!" the Jarl roared. "We are brothers, bound by oath and by blood. There will be no fighting under my roof." Eric's jaw clenched. He bowed his head, just enough to hide the fury in his eyes. "As you wish, Jarl, but know this, some oaths were forged in lies." That night, sleep did not come. The wind howled outside, beating snow against the wooden walls. Eric sat by the dying fire, his sword laid across his knees. His mind churned like a storm tide. Flashes of Astrid's gaze, Sigrvald's smirk, Harold's silence. Then a sound, a door creaking open, bare feet on the wood. Astrid appeared, wrapped in a fur cloak. The firelight danced on her hair. "You shouldn't be here," Eric whispered. "Nor should you," she replied softly, kneeling beside him. "They said you were dead." "I was," he said bitterly, "until I remembered I had unfinished business." She reached out, fingers trembling, tracing the scar on his cheek. "You should leave this place, Eric." "Things are not as they were." He caught her wrist. "Because of him?" Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't answer. "Does Harold know?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "He gave his blessing." The words hit him like a spear to the chest. For a moment he couldn't speak. Only the fire crackled between them. "Then the gods truly mock me," he said finally, voice low. "I crossed death's door only to find my kin had built a throne for the man who betrayed me." Astrid looked at him, not with pity but sorrow. "Sigrvald has changed. He has Harold's ear. The men follow him now. If you stay, they will find reason to kill you." He stood slowly, towering above her. "Let them try. Eric, please." But he turned away, pulling on his cloak. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees like the voice of the dead. By morning the snow was red. They came for him before dawn, 6 of them, armed and quiet. He had seen it coming. When the first man stepped through the door, Eric's sword sang. Steel flashed, blood splattered across the wall. The others rushed in, shouting, slipping on the icy floor, but he moved like the wolf they named him after. When it was over, only one man crawled toward the door, gasping. Eric grabbed him by the collar. "Who sent you?" he growled. The man's eyes rolled back. Sigrvald." Eric let him drop, lifeless. The truth burned cold in his gut. There would be no peace now, only war. He took his cloak, his axe, and his ship, Frostfang, still tethered by the frozen shore. A few loyal men joined him, Bjorn, Torsten, Runa, and 2 younger warriors who had once served his father. As the oars hit the water, the rising sun bled across the horizon like a wound. Eirik looked back at Jorvikheim one last time, the smoke curling above its roofs, the banners snapping in the wind. "Let them call me outlaw," he said. "The gods will judge who is true." 3 days they sailed through bitter winds, hugging the coastline where the sea met jagged cliffs. Gulls followed them, and once a raven. Runa took it as a sign. "The Allfather watches," she murmured. Eirik said nothing. The sea grew crueler. Ice formed along the hull. They sang to keep their hands from freezing, old songs of heroes and death. On the 4th night the storm came. It was not a storm of men, but of the gods. Winds screamed like berserkers. Waves rose like mountains, crashing down with fury. The Frostfang groaned, its timbers cracking. Bjorn shouted to the men, but his voice was swallowed by the sea. Eirik took the helm, hair whipping across his face, eyes blazing. "Hold fast!" he roared. "No wave shall take us unless the gods themselves command it." Lightning split the sky. For an instant he thought he saw the shadow of a great figure upon the clouds, one-eyed and cloaked. Then darkness. He awoke on a shore of ice and silence. The wreckage of the Frostfang lay scattered like bones across the beach. Only Runa and Thorsten had survived. The sky was grey, endless. The cold sank deep into the soul. Somewhere far off, wolves howled. Runa knelt by the water's edge, whispering prayers. Thorsten stood watch. Blood dried on his face. Eirik pushed himself to his feet. "Where are we?" Thorsten shook his head. "Somewhere north of the world." Runa pointed toward the cliffs rising in the distance, black stone against white sky. "There," she said, "the island of Frostheim. It is real." Eirik's gaze followed the cliffs. If the legends were true, the heart of the north, the power to bind men's fate, lay hidden there. He clenched his fist. "Sigurvald took my home," he said, "then let the gods give me something greater." The wind had a voice on that island, low and endless, like the whisper of forgotten gods. Frostheim stretched before them, a wasteland of snow, black rock and frozen rivers that glimmered like glass under a dead sky. The cliffs rose sheer and cruel, streaked with ancient ice that caught what little light the sun still gave. Eirik stood upon the shore, his cloak torn and stiff with frost. Behind him, the broken remnants of his ship smoked faintly, its timbers now food for ravens. Runa and Thorsten waited in silence, their faces pale from cold and loss. "This is where the Norns led us," Runa said quietly, "beyond the edge of the world." Eric's breath steamed in the air. "Then beyond it we'll walk." They gathered what they could from the wreck, axes, ropes, the last of the dried fish. The sea had taken the rest. When the wind shifted, it carried the sound of distant horns, not of men, but something older, stranger, the kind that echoed through the bones. The ascent. It took them 2 days to climb the cliffs. By night, the cold bit through fur and flesh alike. Thorsten's hands cracked and bled. Runa's lips were blue, yet she murmured prayers to the old gods between each breath. At last they reached the high plain. There they found a valley filled with stone pillars, tall as giants and carved with runes that pulsed faintly in the snow, like veins of light beneath the earth. Between them the wind did not blow, it whispered. Thorsten shivered. "I don't like this place." Eirik traced a finger across one of the runes, its edge smooth and warm to the touch despite the frost. "These are older than men," he said. "Older than even the sagas." Runa knelt beside him. "They say Frostheim was the burial ground of kings who defied Odin. Their souls wander here, chained by ice." Eirik looked up, eyes narrowing. "Then perhaps one still guards what I seek." The ghosts of the north. That night they made camp among the stones. The fire burned low, but its light was swallowed by the mist that began to coil around them like living smoke. From somewhere far off came the faint sound of chanting, deep voices, rhythmic, echoing through the valley. Thorsten gripped his axe. "We're not alone." Eirik rose, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Stay by the fire." He moved through the mist, each step muffled by snow. The chanting grew louder, rising and falling like the tide. Soon he saw shapes moving, tall, cloaked, faceless. He called out, "Who walks here?" No answer, only the wind. Then one of the shapes turned toward him. Its eyes burned pale blue, like stars under ice. "Eric Wolfeye," the voice said, cold and hollow. "The sea was not meant to return you." Eric steadied his blade. Then the sea failed. The figure drifted closer. Its cloak fluttered, though no wind touched it. "You seek the heart of the north, but power born of gods is paid in blood." Eric's grip tightened. "Whose blood?" The spirit raised an arm, and around them the mist thickened until he could barely breathe. "Yours," it whispered, "or hers." And in that moment, the mist parted, revealing Runa far off by the fire, her face bathed in blue light. Eirik lunged forward. The spectre vanished, and when he reached camp, the fire was out. Runa was on her knees, her eyes wide in terror. Torsten stood over her, frozen, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "They spoke," she gasped. "Voices in the dark. They know your name, Eric. They said, 'The gods have not forgiven you.'" Eric looked around, sword drawn, but the night had gone silent again. Only the runes still glowed, pulsing softly, as if alive. He sat down beside the cold fire. "Let them watch," he said. "I will not turn back." The Frozen Temple. On the third day, they found the temple. It stood in a hollow between the cliffs, a vast dome of ice and stone, its entrance guarded by statues of warriors whose faces were worn smooth by time. The door was sealed by frost, carved with runes that glimmered faintly beneath the snow. Runa traced the markings. These symbols speak of balance, blood for truth, heart for power, Torsten spat. "Old witchcraft! Let's turn back before it eats our souls." Eric shook his head. "We came this far. The man who betrayed me believes me dead, but I will return stronger than he can imagine." He pressed his hand to the ice. At once the runes flared, white and blinding. The ground trembled. Then, slowly, the gate of frost split open with a groan that echoed for miles. Inside, the air was still, too still. Columns of crystal rose high as trees, refracting pale light that had no source. And at the far end of the hall, upon an altar carved from black ice, pulsed a shard of light, the heart of the north. It was smaller than he had imagined, a stone of pure blue fire encased in veins of frost that shimmered like stars. Runa fell to her knees. "By the All-Father, it's real." Eric stepped forward. His reflection scattered 1,000 times across the frozen walls. His hand hovered above the crystal. Warmth radiated from it, though it should have been cold. Torsten grabbed his arm. "Don't! You don't know what it is." Eric looked at him, eyes hard. "I know what it must be. The strength to take back what was stolen." He grasped the heart. For an instant, silence. Then a shock like lightning ripped through his body. Visions burst behind his eyes. Fire, blood, storms, gods with one eye and wolves of shadow. His knees buckled. The world shattered. He saw a great tree, roots tangled in the sea, branches piercing the sky. Upon one limb sat Odin himself, face veiled in storm clouds. "Why do you reach for what is not yours?" the god's voice thundered. Eirik tried to speak, but his lips did not move. "I seek justice." "Justice is the language of men," Odin said. "You seek vengeance, and that tongue I know well." Lightning struck. The ground split open beneath Eric's feet, revealing rivers of molten ice, and within them faces screaming in eternal silence. "You would take power meant for gods?" Odin's voice grew closer, darker, then be marked by it. A raven's cry pierced the sky, and darkness swallowed him whole. When he woke, the temple was gone. He lay in the snow at the foot of the cliffs. Runa knelt beside him, tears frozen on her cheeks. Torsten was gone. "What happened?" he whispered. "You touched it," she said. "The light consumed you. Then the ground. It swallowed him." Eric sat up slowly. His body trembled, but not from cold. His left eye burned with a faint blue glow, like a dying ember beneath ice. Runa stared. The mark of the gods. He rose, testing his limbs. Power thrummed beneath his skin, quiet but immense, like the heartbeat of the earth. Torsten is dead, she said softly. We should leave this cursed island. Eric turned toward the sea. No, not yet. He looked to the horizon, where storm clouds gathered once more, and somewhere beyond them, Sigurvald sat on Harald's throne. The gods have given me a gift, he said, and I will use it to make the world remember my name. They said the North remembered him before the men of his village did. Eric walked ashore not as the man who had left with swagger and songs, but as something reshaped, not wholly man, not wholly myth. The mark in his eye hummed like a bell beneath his skin, small and constant. When he blinked into sunlight, the colour lingered, a faint tide of blue that did not belong to any mortal iris. It made children glance twice, and dogs whine, and old women cross themselves. He had thought the heart of the North would grant him the blunt, simple strength of iron. Instead, it had given him a kind of seeing, a knowing that cut like a keen-edged rune. He could hear sometimes the soft scuff of far-off footsteps. He could taste the change of weather in the air before a cloud had even formed. Power, he realized, was not always the loud shout of battle. Much of it was a quiet, small, cruel knowledge that made the world part like a curtain so you could step through. Runa and the rest who remained followed him on the last stretch home. They moved slow, careful as those who carry a dead thing in their hands. Villages which once welcomed them with open hearths shut their doors. Word moved faster than them. The outlaw who had sailed north, the captain who had struck down men, the one who had touched a god and come back crooked. Rumour offered them a dozen endings, and none of them gentle. Yet Eric felt no fear. The heart's whisper steadied him. Where formerly he had stalked his enemies like a wolf through brush, now he walked like a man at the bottom of a well who suddenly sees a light, a thin, steady thing he could reach for. They reached the inland road in the depth of autumn. Frost crusted the leaves. The air smelled like wood smoke and dried peat. The road wound like an old memory toward Jorvikheim and Hrafnhall, toward horned faces and the faces of those he loved and those who had betrayed him. He kept his face as stone. At night he lay beside the fire and listened to the land. There were small miracles. He could tell by the way a birch limb shivered where the wolves hunted beyond the ridge. He could hear, faint under a miller's wheel, the whisper of a song that had not been sung in those parts for years. The gift was not always comfort. Sometimes the knowing was a needle in his ear, prickling and precise. In the third village, where a woman sold salted fish, and where children still had the reckless honesty of youth, a boy ran up and threw his small body into Eric's chest, eyes bright. "Eric, you're home!" "Did you find the Sea King's gold?" he demanded. Eric let the boy's laughter land and buoy him. He ruffled the child's hair, a small human motion that steadied him. "Not gold, little one," he said, "but a story to tell." The boy ran off to shout of a tale that would grow with each telling. Rumour again, but some rumours carried warmth. They camped beyond the last fields by the river that cut through Harald's lands. Eric kept his men well away from prying eyes and ears. He knew Sigurvald's reach was long. The man had taken Harald's favour, and with it the kind of permission that allowed cups to be spilled at strangers' throats. Among Eric's small band, loyalty ran deeper than fear. Bjorn had bled and laced the helms of new boats. Runa kept her knife sharp and her heart quieter than most. There were others, men and women who owed him a life or a favour, and those small oaths accumulated like flint. Together they could make a spark. The first move he made toward Hrafnhall was not by the front gate. He sent Halvard, a lean, quick-handed boy whose body had become familiar with climbing, to probe the outer paths. Halvard returned one night with news that the Jarl's Hall was surrounded by a new kind of order. Men on the roads, black dogs with slow yellow eyes, and a sense of watchfulness like a hand on a throat. "The Jarl has raised taxes," Halvard reported, breathless. "They say it is for defence, but nobody sees a guard but those who take the taxes. Sigurvald rides with the Jarl almost every day." Eric felt nothing outwardly. though a low fury rolled through his chest like a distant tide. He had come looking for revenge in the shape of a blade at the throat. What he had found instead was a more modern theft, favours exchanged like coins, weddings used as ploughs to turn the fields of loyalty. Sigurvald had learned that men were often more easily broken with contracts than with spears. He moved carefully, learning. He watched the pattern of the hall's life, the times the gate opened, the men who left and who returned, how wine was served to Sigurvald first, how the Jarl answered questions in small clipped silences. The heart of the north pulsed, not always loud, but like a drum under a floorboard. He felt the mood of the hall like a physical thing. It was heavy and warm, laced with old fires and new lies. Eric's first deliberate strike was one of language and small sabotage. He sent 2 of his men, Rurik and Jarn, to the outskirts at night to burn a small granary that Sigurvald used for trade with the southern Jarl. The granary's loss would be an annoyance, not a crippling blow. The aim was to prove that Sigurvald's protection was not as impenetrable as it seemed. The fire was set. It took easily in the dry wood. The smoke climbed, and the men who watched the hall's shipments cursed and worried. But Sigurvald's men were quick. They outpaced Rurik and Jarn and killed them not with an army, but with a shadow and rope. Their bodies were found a day later, hung from crooked branches. The message was plain. Eric felt the fierce animal part of him want to tear the world down. He tamped it down. Violence was easy. Strategy was the slower, colder hand that won wars. He sent a message, forged with careful script, to one of Harold's old allies, Jarl Hrolf, a stubborn man who was half drunk with his own grievances against Harold for a decades-old insult. The letter was written in a voice of diplomacy, but threaded with the sting of truth, hinting at Sigurvald's overreach and promising that Eric had friends willing to stand if Hrolf did not want to be shaved by Harold's new taxes. It was the work of a man who had learned to speak the language of men who prize discretion. Hrolf responded with a slow, amused note. He would consider the matter if Eric could present proof that Harold's court had become a nest of thieves. Proof, then. Eirik thought of the heart and its swift, cold seeing. He thought of Sigurvald's ring, Harold's signet now worn by the traitor. Proof did not have to be a stolen chest of coin. It could be a confession recorded in a place that could not be easily ignored, at a feast in front of men and women and the Jarl's own vassals. He needed a spectacle. Astrid's face hovered in his mind like a torch he did not wish yet could not extinguish. She was both a wound and a key. If he could speak to her and pull her from Hakon's machinations, or show her a truth so plain that even she could not deny it, he might set in motion things that would force Sigurvald's hand. Eric sent a whisper through the village grapevine, contrived and careful, that there would be a small memorial feast for the men lost in the storms along the western route. The grief was real enough. 100 small absences could be stitched into a thread of mourning. The memorial would be held at a neutral hall where both men and women of various claims could attend without fear of immediate reprisal. The chosen place sat between Hrafnhall and the Jarl's Hall, where Harold could not refuse to be seen without cause. When the day came, Eric strode into the hall, the blue in his eye dull but present. He carried with him grief like an instrument tuned to a specific note. Men gathered, merchants, freedmen, warriors, folk who had sent sons and husbands to the sea. Among them were Sigurvald and Astrid, Harold's ring glittering on Sigurvald's hand like a promise. Eirik stood to speak. He told stories of the men lost at sea, men with names, children, songs. He made them real so that the crowd's grief could not be easily bought with daisies. His voice was steady, threaded through with a warmth no one expected from a man who had danced with gods. When he finished, the hall was still. Men clanked cups. Sigurvald stepped forward and announced, with a smoothness that made some in the crowd bark a little laugh, that he had been working with Harold to secure the trade routes, and that Harold had been forced to make hard choices. "We do what we must," Sigurvald said. "Let the wolves of rumour howl. The flock must be kept." Eric felt the heart's patter like the remembrance of a drumline. He did not shout. He did not strike. He walked to the centre of the hall and spoke in a voice that wrapped itself around truth like a binding. "Who among you remembers the winter before last?" he asked, when Harold sent a party to retrieve the signet ring of his father from a small cove by the Black Cliff. "Who remembers that the Jarl's party did not return?" Murmurs, heads bowed. Among the older men, a few nodded. For them, the detail was like a bone they had picked at for years. "I was there," Eric said quietly. He told, simply, how a lie had been made into a truth by silence, how Harold had once lost men to the sea, and then used those losses as a ledger to gain alliances. He told of how Sigurvald, still a younger man then, had proposed the marriage pact to strengthen Harold's claims. He showed, when he could, hints that were not proofs. A coin, a half-buried token, the likeness of a seal, and then he stepped back. In the crowd, disquiet grew like a wind under a sail. Sigurvald's face had hardened. He stepped forward and spat that Eric spoke lies. The Jarl, modest and small-mannered in his temperament when confronted with the noise of his court, called for men to present evidence. Words collided and fell like hammers. Then something happened that Eric had not entirely planned, but which the heart of the North had whispered to him in the small watches of the night. Astrid rose. Her face was pale. She walked not with the sweetness of a child groomed for sale, but with the quiet strength of someone who had carried grief for a long time, and finally chose to place it on a table. "Enough," she said. The word fell like a blade. She moved to Sigurvald. For a heartbeat the room held its breath. She placed a single finger on his ring. "You wear what is not yours," she said. "It is not merely a trinket. It is a seal of promises. Did you take this by your own hand, or was it given?" Sigurvald's jaw worked. Harold's eyes flicked between his friend and his daughter. No one moved. Astrid then revealed what no one expected, that she had, in secret, kept a small ledger from the hall, a list of shipments and tolls and men who aided the Jarl. She had hidden it like a child hides a toy beneath the bed of her own chamber. She produced it now, its pages stained with candle soot, and opened to a page that bore Sigurvald's mark, 2 unflattering notations that betrayed shipments diverted and men sent to quiet those who questioned. At that moment the hall divided, a crack in a frozen pond. Sigurvald's friends turned purple with anger. Men who had felt the pressure of new taxes and unnatural raids saw in Astrid's quiet revelation proof of theft. Harold rose and found himself struck by the strange and terrible force of being seen. His mouth, usually a soft gate for comfortable lies, closed. "You betray me," he said finally, voice small. Astrid's eyes were wet, but she did not step back. "You betrayed the truth when you loved comfort more than justice." She looked at Sigurvald. "You seduced me with speeches and promises, and my father with convenience. Whatever love you claim, you built it with the bones of men." Sigurvald reacted with a hate the hall had not yet measured. He leapt forward, hand to ring, and reached for Astrid, either to silence or to strike. Eric moved like a shadow and intercepted him. They grappled, old friendship and new hatred tangling. Sigurvald struck first with a fist, met with an elbow, and then a blade glittered in the light. One of his men had drawn a knife. The hall became a place of knives and screams. Cups shattered like small moons. Men tore between friend and oath. Eric fought not with frenzy but with the cold joy of a man who knows his angles. He used the heart's sharpened sight, a movement that saw a hand's arc a second earlier, a pivot that put him where muscle would later arrive. He did not let Sigurvald's rage choose the outcome. When it was over, men lay injured. Sigurvald sat on the floor, blood staining his sleeve, ring tarnished and smeared. Harold's face was gone, older than his years, as if a shadow had taken a bite from his edges. Astrid remained standing, brave and broken. "You would make me a traitor," Harold said at last, though the sound was like a man that had swallowed frost. "You would let my hall be shamed." "You made your bed," Astrid said quietly. She looked at Eric. "You came home and forced the truth into the light." Harold stood. He realized then that the hall had split and that something irreparable had been done. He could rail, he could call the guards and hang Eirik like a warning. But the merchants, the tradesmen, the quiet men whose livelihoods had been nicked for the sake of Sigurvald's schemes had seen the ledger. Their anger had a weight Harold could not easily lift. Sigurvald's men, smelling the change, carried him from the hall under a veil of borers and curses. He spat threats at Eric that a dog could have heard as nothing more than wind. Before he left, he turned to the Jarl and hissed, "If you do not clear me, I will clear you from the seats of power. Men like Eric will not make you safe." The threat landed in the hall like a thrown stone. Harold's throat worked. He had already lost much: stability, the smugness of power. Now he lost the easy certainty that the Jarl's will could arrange the lives of his people. After the chaos, the hall smelled like blood and smoke and something else, the beginning of a reckoning. Eric left that place with nothing but a handful of quiet men and the knowledge that the world had changed. The heart's mark pulsed steady. He felt at once lighter and more burdened. Power shifted. Now people knew there was a man who would not hide the truth. But the work of changing men's minds was a slow art. It required more than spectacle. It required the plumbing of trust. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Astrid came to him by the river and did not look away. There were no promises then, no tender speeches. There was only the simple, honest knowledge that much had been burned, and that both of them now held smouldering embers in their hands. "I did not know how much came at the cost of my father's ease," she said. "I'm sorry." Eric took her hand gently and held it. For a moment the world was a simple place. 2 hands, 2 hearts, a fire between them. Then the wind whispered the names of men who still breathed in halls where truth was an enemy. He remembered Torsten, lost in the white, and Rurik and Jarn hanged upon branches. He remembered the feel of the heart's shock in his veins. "If this is to be more than a moment, we must plan not for the day, but for the seasons," he said. "Sigurvald will not be undone by one ledger and a hall's shame. He will hit back. We must be ready." Astrid looked into his eyes, into the faint blue that glimmered like a secret. She nodded. "Tell me what to do." Eric felt suddenly that he was not alone. The heart gave him sight and the world gave him allies, but the road ahead was a knife path. Every step demanded courage and a cool hand. He knew the next moves would be brittle. A single misstep would send men into the dark. He thought of the island's cold heart and the way it had changed him. He thought of the price whispered by spectres in the mist. Power, the spirits had told him, came by blood as well as by will. He had to decide if he would pay that price, and how many others would be forced to give theirs with him. They planned in low voices. They met merchants and freedmen, old soldiers and men who had felt the Jarl's tax like a knife at their throats. They traded favours and sometimes, brutally, promises of retribution. The country itself began to feel like a loom being rethreaded. Threads would cross, be pulled, be burned, and in the end a new cloth might be woven, one with Eirik's face upon it. Sigurvald did not let the night swallow him. He rode with fury and the taste of humiliation in his mouth. He gathered allies in the south, those who preferred the stability of favoured men to the messy honesty that Eirik and Astrid represented. He would find those who had been insulted by the ledger and stroke their anger until it burned white. He would play again the old game of bargains and fear. The first strike came like a summer storm, sudden and loud. A village near Jakun's ford burned while the folk slept. Men were taken in the night and found days later with throats slit in lonely ditches. A merchant caravan was waylaid by men wearing Sigurvald's colours. Its goods were dispersed to those who paid for loyalty. Rumours flew like locusts and landed in hungry mouths. Eirik's men responded in kind, not in brazen raids, but in the crippling of supply lines, in the poisoning of some of Sigurvald's coin holders with the truth, and in exposing men whose loyalty had been bought with the Jarl's hollow promises. The country became a chessboard. Pieces moved. Pawns were sacrificed. The winter leaned in. Snow fell early and the world narrowed. The heart's glow in Eirik's eye pulsed with the seasons, steady as a metronome. He moved with careful energy. Where a blade might kill, a spoken rumour might free an ally or close a road. His newest skill was to unmake what others assumed would hold, to turn Sigurvald's men against him not with hatred but with reason. Yet in the hollow between victories lay the cost the island's ghosts had warned of. Each time Eirik reached with the heart's sight, something unseen moved inside him. He dreamed of faces of men he had not met, frozen kings with mouths sewn, sailors who had traded their oaths for a keepsake. The heart seemed curious, like an animal that learns by tasting every shade of what it chews. One night, after a small success in the north, a caravan of Sigurvald's men turned away by a band of mercenaries paid by Eric's allies. Eric lay alone and thought of the slow erosion of self that power asked for. He thought of Torsten's empty eyes and the way Rurik had spat in the snow when he spoke of oaths. He thought of Astrid standing in the hall, calm and terrible and brave. He thought of his father's voice, long dead, telling him that a man's worth is measured by the debts he pays and the promises he keeps. The heart pulsed faint and beautiful. It asked nothing direct, but its presence worked. He knew the path ahead would demand payment, not of coin, but something deeper. Already he felt the first small accounting, emotions dulled, a patience that bordered on cruelty when decisions were necessary. He had become the instrument that the story required, not an accidental man who wandered into legend. The price was a self he might not entirely want later, a man who could see too far and with it lose the bliss of ignorance. At the edge of that dark thought, a raven landed on the sill of his small room. It tilted its head. For a long moment Eric simply watched, the little blue in his eye like an echo of winter. "You're with me, then?" he asked, half laughing at the absurdity. The raven croaked and flew off into a night that smelled of spruce and old ale. The war would continue, men would die, perhaps many. He had become, by slow degrees and by a stark set of choices, the storm that chased a man who had once betrayed him. He was the wolf returned, but a wolf with runes pressed under its skin. When the snows finally fell in earnest and the land hardened, Sigurvald made his move. He struck at the north with a force so sudden it resembled an avalanche. Men came from the south like a dark tide, banners black and red. The Jarl's hall was besieged by the consequences of its earlier decisions. Men who had been paid to smile now had to choose between a Jarl who could not guarantee their wages and the man who had walked into a winter to pull a shard of godfire onto his palm. Sigurvald thought the show of force would crush Eric's scattered allies. He thought men would prefer the clarity of being on the winning side. History had never taught him how quickly farmers and merchants might become soldiers if their barns were threatened. Eric received the news of the march from Halvard, who had caught the route by a narrow road. Halvard's breath came quick, eyes bright with both fear and elation. "They come like wolves," he said. "You must choose now." Eric slept little in those nights. He strapped the wolf's tooth to his chest and stood where he could look east and south both. He had the heart's sight to see the faults in Sigurvald's plans, the places where his supply lines would snap. He had also men who were used to the cold and to quick movements and to the way a blade speaks when a throat opens. He sent riders, he spelled misdirections, and he set small, precise traps. On the day the armies met, the country was white and hard as a shield. The sound of it was a thunder that had been waiting in the sky. Horn calls, the clatter of iron, the low voice of command. Men stood like statues, each time a breath forming a small cloud before their mouths. It began at dawn when Sigurvald's men charged intent on crushing Eric's allies, who had taken a small pass. The cavalry were heavy and cruel. They stamped earth and pushed men like a storm pushes boats. But Eric had not chosen the battlefield by accident. He had baited them onto a slope where the snow was loose, where the first push would thin and the second would find its foot not where it expected. The fighting was terrible and precise. Eric moved among his men like a man whose hands had been trained by gods to find the correct place to step. He was not the reckless warrior of old. He was calmly brutal, taking what the heart allowed without sacrificing skill for spectacle. Sigurvald's men found themselves bogged, slipping, keys in locks they could not pick. Men on their side grew weary and cold, their breath coming like steam. Then, as a shape in the sky, Bjorn and a handful of riders struck Sigurvald's flank. The Jarl's Hall men looked up and saw the banners of their comrades turned and fled. In a matter of hours the tide had turned like a gate swung by a strong hand. Sigurvald himself was not easily found at first. His men carried him away when he was wounded, but not before he had a hand upon the shoulder of one of Eric's lieutenants, and hissed that this was not over. He would lick his wounds and come again as any predator that has tasted blood does. The victory was priced with many small losses. Rune lay with a broken arm and a deep gash. Halvard's shoulder was slashed. Men grieved, and men sang in the same breath as their kind does. When at last the field railed with quiet, Eric stood with the wind cutting his face and looked at the horizon. Snow drifted and covered the traces of men like a soft hand. He had won a battle that might alter the arc of a season's fate. The Jarl's Hall would think twice about its thieveries for the coming year. But he also knew full well that victory did not make justice. It bought him time. It made him a name again. It made the heart hum with approval and with something darker, amusement perhaps. Astrid found him then, wrapped in furs though the cold cut at both of them. She did not speak. She only took his hand with a steadiness born of shared losses. She had seen what the price of struggle looked like up close. Men who had lost children to hunger, or to Sigurveld's men. Elders who wept softly for a peace that had been broken for profit. She had also seen how the land responded when given a figure around whom to organize, a leader who had the look of a man who had touched divinity and come away with a task. They did not celebrate with ale and boastful songs. They spoke quietly about the future, about reconstruction, about where to place trust, about the slow work of ensuring Sigurveld could not gather enough to strike again. Each victory required a new kind of mending, laws to protect merchants from being taxed into poverty, alliances that would bind men by oath, and proof, the return of goods that had been stolen. They spoke of ways to make Harold repent more publicly, and to make his restitution something that could be watched by all. Public truth, Eric had found, is sometimes sharper than justice. Eric lay awake that night, the heart's pulse slow and satisfied, but never quite sleeping. He thought of the island and the spectral voices that had told him power would be paid in blood. He had paid and been paid. He had won and he had lost. The ledger of vengeance was balanced in both profit and loss. A raven tapped at his window and shifted its head. Eric stood and opened the latch. It hopped onto his palm and took a small scrap of meat. For a moment he simply watched the bird, this small black god, and felt the truth, a quiet one, settle in him. Power changes men. It reveals them. It reveals what they valued before and rearranges their priorities into new forms. He had returned as a wolf and shaped the land into new lines. He had not taken the easy course. He had made the kind of change that both irrigates and drowns. But when he looked at Astrid's face, he saw something like a future that was not merely the rewriting of old debts. He saw a possibility of building a life out of the ruins the men had made. He took the thought and spun it like a new rune. The days that followed were occupied with repair. The Jarl, chastened and a little shamed by the ledger and the public turning of his people, promised a public recompense for those whose goods had been misused. It was a promise bound in noise and witnesses. Parliament of a kind made on the frozen moor. Sigurvald swore revenge in the shadows where men forget the names they owe. Eric's men grew plump with food and thin with the loss of companions. The heart's glow in his eye pulsed now with cautious contentment and the faint spiralling hunger of a thing that had learned to want. He used the power, not to crown himself king, but to knit the country back together in a way that made the old thefts harder to repeat. He insisted on transparent ledgers for halls. He taught men to check their accounts and presented them with proof. He placed his name as an oath upon the mouths of tradesmen. He made justice, by slow degrees, a civic thing instead of a private tool. Perhaps this was his truest victory. Not that Sigurvald had been driven into the cold, licking his wounds, but that the habits that had given him life, secrecy, favouritism, the trimming of men's rights, had been pried open. But there would always be men who preferred things the old way. There would always be those who had been bought or were easily bought. There would always be the dark places where Sigurvald could hide and the hunger of lesser men who would gladly take bribes. Eric had not freed the world from its hunger. He had merely changed the course of one winter. When the long night finally pressed in, and the northern sky lit with a fierce aurora, painting the fields in green and blue and the ancient colours of myth, Eric stood upon a ridge outside the village and watched the light shimmer. The heart's blue was faint but present in his eye, matching the sky. He thought of the island where he had first found the crystal, and the cost of that finding. He thought of Torsten, and of the ghosts in the fog. He thought of Astrid warming her hands by a hearth that had once felt destined for Sigrvald. He breathed deep the cold air and felt at last a small peace. It was not a peace of finality or of end. It was the kind of peace that arrives after a battle, the quiet that follows the sword's last swing. The land was breathing with him. He had set a new course, and though the long winter would still take its toll, the stitches he had sown would protect more than they would punish. A raven cried overhead, and then dove away toward the north, where the cliffs of Frostheim rose like the teeth of a frozen god. Eric closed his eyes and listened to the world. He had been returned from death, set with the gift that a god sometimes gives, and like all such gifts it had a sharp edge. He had chosen to use it to bind men together rather than to crown himself. There was work yet to do. Men would still be treacherous, and the Jarl's Hall's old habits would not die. They would merely move back into shadows. But Eric was no longer the man who had left. He was a being with an oath written in bone and rune, with a partner who had chosen to stand with him, and with a subtle, terrible power that could find the true line in a lie. He walked down into the village where a child called his name. The boy's laugh filled the air with sound like spilled coins, bright and small. Eric knelt and lifted the child onto his shoulders. The blue in his eye caught the light and looked like a glint of the northern sky. Around him men moved and worked and joked. It was a fragile thing, this measure of peace, and he would protect it. Far to the north, on a cold island with cliffs and ruins and the heart of a god encased in ice, the stone pulsed like a slow, patient drum, answering perhaps to the deeds of men whose names were not only carved in halls, but lived in the mouths and hearts of the people. The heart had marked him, changed him. In the end, he had used its sight not to rule, but to mend. He rose from the child's shoulders and strode into the hall where men sat to eat and sing by the firelight. The blue of the aurora shivered across the windows, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Eric lifted his cup and drank, and at last, with the taste of peat and mead on his tongue, permitted himself to grin. There were more winters to come. There would be more battles and more reckonings, but for the first time in a long while, Eric Wolfeye felt certain of one thing. He had been given a chance not just to avenge what was stolen, but to place the kind of order in the world that might let people's voices be heard above the clattering of coins and the whisper of favours. The wolves would still prowl, but their shadows would no longer fall unchallenged across the hearths of the innocent. The light of the aurora raised the dark into ribbons of green and blue. Eric raised his cup and drank to the living and the dead, to the men who had followed him, to the women who had chosen truth, and to the island that had given him a terrible gift. The wolf's tooth at his throat seemed to hum in agreement. The thaw that followed the victory was thin and treacherous. Snow melted in crooked ribbons that revealed the scars of winter. Barns broken, fences down, a single crow perched on a splintered post where a man's cart had once been. Men laboured with the numb patience of those who rebuild what storms have taken, but the land held the memory of war in the roots and in the look of folk who had watched neighbours fall. Eric moved through that slow repair like a man learning to carry the new weight of his sight. The heart's blue throbbed at the edge of consciousness. It was no longer a bright flare but a steady presence, a companion and a counsel that breathed in the dark. It let him see patterns and read intent as one reads the grain of wood. That knowledge had built bridges and broken schemes. It had also made him oddly distant, a man whose kindness came measured and whose humour was thin as a coin. Astrid walked at his side more often now, not merely as a lover but as an equal who kept his temper honest and his plans human. Her hands had calluses from keeping accounts, and a face still tender enough to soften the lines the seasons had carved into his. In the long evenings she would sit by the fire and stitch new ledgers, her fingers moving methodically, and they would speak of small practical things, where to place watchmen, which merchants to trust, who had yet to be paid back. In her presence, the seed of home felt possible, yet the shadow lingered. Sigurvald slunk south to lick his wounds and gather new allies. The man's fury had hardened into resolve. He had found supporters where greed and fear found purchase, in men whose loyalty was a currency, and in halls that would sell the comfort of untroubled trade for a platter of coin. The southern Jarl, an ambitious fellow called Jarl Vemund, had offered Sigurvald what he craved: troops, ships, and a promise that the reach of his influence would stretch northward like a net. When word reached Eric that Sigurvald was raising new forces, larger and more professional than the hastily gathered rabble of his first attempt, the heart's glow tightened like a ring. Eirik felt more sharply than ever the responsibility that had come with the gift. He had used the power to expose rotten roots. Now he faced a different test: how to use it without becoming the very thing he fought. Sigurvald's strategy had been cunning. He would not simply march with banners and demand the Jarl's seat. He would strike where men were soft, where trust lived undisturbed. He had begun to bribe and coerce the smaller halls, to buy midwives' silence, and to bend the loyalty of men whose families relied upon his protection. In those places, fear of sudden destitution beats pride. Bread fills bellies easier than truth can fill a wound. Eric saw it all as if a map had been unfolded in his head. He could see the routes the supply wagons would take, the hidden caches of weapons, the men Tormod the blacksmith might be persuaded to supply. He could see Sigurvald's lieutenants in his mind's eye, their habits, the way their shadows fell at noon, the ruts in their boots. The knowledge was a small, sharp instrument. It could be used deftly or wielded with the bluntness of rage. Runa, recovering from her half-healed arm, served as Eirik's sentinel for the north. She moved like a thing carved by wind and sharpened with iron. Her laughs were rarer now, but when she smiled the men around her remembered why they followed. Bjorn kept his hand steady, and his jokes short. He had a talent for finding the one path in a field that would not be monitored, and guiding small bands through it. They worked to fortify weak places. Ledgers were audited with a frankness that made merchants groan and made thieves shiver. The Jarl, chastened but still jockeying for safety, tried to mollify the men with reparations and public oaths. The measures kept some men honest and drove others into Sigurvald's arms. It was cyclical as the tide. One of the more subtle victories came when a ship captain named Einar, who had been taking goods north under Sigurvald's protection, found his hold empty one night. Someone, Eric's men, had intercepted a shipment and replaced most of the cargo with worthless stones. The captain was scandalized and infuriated. He sought vengeance against those who had deceived him. When Eric himself appeared to receive the captain's anger, dressed in a plain cloak and with the faint blue of the heart dull in his eye, he offered to help make the captain whole, publicly and promptly. Einar chose the clarity of restitution over the shadow of Sigvald's promises. The ripple was small and local, but it hardened into a strand of loyalty that Eric could later weave with others. Even so, the heart's counsel was not always the wisest guide for the human heart. There were nights when Eric lay awake and felt the stone under his rib, not purely as a boon, but as a corrosive. It gave him truth, yes, but truth without mercy can become a tyrant. He had the clarity to understand where Sigurvald would strike. The temptation to cut deeper and to shape the land entirely in his image was a song in his blood. Power sings to men with the voice of simple answers. It was in one such night, when the aurora smeared the sky like a wound of green fire, that a trader named Haldis came to Eric with a pleading tale. Her son had been taken as surety by a petty lord who owed Sigurvald coin. The boy had been marched away to be trained as a binder, a recruit, or worse, shipped south where no one could follow. Haldis, a small woman with a face like baked bread and a throat lined with worry, begged Eric to recover the boy. The heart showed Eric the route, a narrow pass and a small contingent of men escorting the captives. He could see the moment where a guard would stop to wash his face, the place where one could strike and take back several boys. The plan was precise. The promise of rescue was noble and would win support from the village women whose sons were conscripted. It was, in short, an ideal use of the gift. They moved at dusk. Halvard led a small band with the cautious joy of a man who had performed a risky theft and not been undone yet. The ambush was a whisper, a muffled sound and the soft fall of bodies. Boys were freed, tears and laughter mingling in the snow until the noise made Eric's ears ring with relief. In the aftermath, when Haldis's boy clung to Eric's cloak and called him a saviour, Eric felt a warmth that the heart had no hand in creating. It was purely human. He understood, in that moment, why men risk poems and lives for small acts of mercy. Mercy, it turned out, was a currency as sturdy as coin, but mercy also invited cost. That night a scout returned with news that a delegation from Jarl Vaemund had marched along the coast and burned a small hamlet loyal to Eric. The message was clear. Sigrvald, bolstered by Vaemund's support, would strike where the land was soft and take what would hurt most. The cycle continued. The months tightened into a net. The winter, which had seemed to have lessened in its cruelty, returned with a new bite. Food stores waned, men's patience frayed. Sigrvald threatened the Jarl with vengeance in a dozen whispered hallways. Harald, humiliated and brittle, contemplated an alliance with Vaemund that would leave him a mere figurehead. The dance of politics had taken a darker tempo. Eric's plans had to become surer. He knew he could not rely solely upon the heart to reveal Sigrvald's moves. The stone had its limits, and its pleasure in its owner's decisions felt all too human. He also relied on men, the kind whose loyalty is not minted by silver, but earned by shared cold and shared bread. He had built a network, artisans, women who ran the mills, sailors who would not comply with Vaemund's offers. This community of oaths was fragile but real. Sigrvald's response grew bolder. He would take hostages from minor halls and hold them as bargaining chips until Eric would be forced to yield. One such hostage was an old friend of Runa's, a man named Olvir, who had once watched Runa laugh before love hardened into discipline. Sigrvald held him in chains, a public threat. Runa's grief was a fire that flared without restraint. She wanted to storm the hall and tear Sigrvald out by his beard. Eric forbade rashness. He had learned that vigour without plan was a kindling that burned men. Instead, he used the heart to find the place where Olvir was held, a small keep by a river bend, and to see the pattern of guards. He arranged a rescue that required stealth and patience rather than force. The operation succeeded. Olvir was freed in the night and carried back to Runa in a cart lined with straw and the kind of silence that keeps a secret. Runa's gratitude was deep. She pressed her forehead to Eric's arm like a thing exhaling. Even so, the rescue came with a small toll. The keep's master, embarrassed and ashamed at the theft, chose to ally openly with Sigrvald afterward for protection. The man's fear for his own family outweighed his disgust. Eric felt, with the cold clarity of the heart, how every choice echoed outward in unpredictable ways. The net of loyalties could be knitted, but threads would always be pulled taut again. Then Sigrvald did something that changed the nature of the conflict. He took a child of the Jarl, a brother of Astrid's who had been raised in the hall but considered as Harald's kin. He held the boy not as a bargaining chip for a single indebted hall, but as a symbol, a lever to extract not only goods, but allegiance from Harald. The Jarl seethed and found himself boxed. His face, already lined by shame, became ashen. The men who cared for titles and security bent under pressure. Harald, in an act of desperation that looked like a man drowning throwing a last weight into the sea, asked Eirik to negotiate. The Jarl's voice had become small and shaky. He spoke of honour and the need to restore the hall's standing. Eric, looking at the man who had once been a father to him in arms, felt a jolt of old affection and disillusion together. The choice he made next would carve further into the pattern the heart had set into his life. He went to Sigrvald's camp, alone, robed in ordinary clothes and bearing no weapons in plain sight. The heart hummed like prayer in his chest. He could see the ring on Sigrvald's finger like a small moon. The men around the traitor watched him with the petulant attention of wolves offered a scrap. Sigrvald's smile was a thing polished with arrogance. "You come to beg?" Sigrvald said softly. "I come to bargain," Eirik answered. They met in a low tent. close enough that the smell of men and ale mingled with the cold. The camp hummed outside, a mass of murmurs and sleeping men. Sigurvald was wounded and sullen, his pride a raw knot under his skin. His right hand bore a small line of old dried blood. When he spoke, his voice carried the calculated charm of a man who could sell his friends into silence. "I can give peace," Sigurvald said. "I can give this land a single hand to rule it. Stop shifting loyalties like coins. Let me be the hearth that will hold it. I will call off Vemund if you go home and swear to keep quiet." Eric considered the offer. Peace with Sigurvald would mean a kind of quiet. Less blood, fewer raids, perhaps even safety for the folk who had been burned. But this peace would be bought at the price of truth and justice. Sigurvald would be allowed to keep his advantages. Harold's Hall would be shamed into silence. The ledger of wrongs would be erased in exchange for the sound of ale and the calm of business. The heart watched him like a hawk, showing him the paths where a man's choice stood like a fork in the world. "If I take peace," Eric said finally, "what good is it that my people live quietly while their children are fed by thievery?" Sigurvald's eyes narrowed. "My peace keeps them alive." "And what kind of life is that?" Eric asked. "Where wolves rule with the Jarl's name." Sigurvald laughed. "You do not see the world as I do, Eric. You touch gods, and dream you are made of steel." He rose, leaning forward until the two men were a single shadow. "I will teach you what steel really means. It is the breaking of the little things that men cling to. Trust, love, soft hands. Break them, and the world becomes yours to rebuild." The offer was as sharp as a blade. It was the oldest argument in the book, stability bought with small acts of cruelty. Eric felt his lips tighten, the heart pressed cold against his chest like a reminder. He thought of Thorstein and Rurik, of the boys they had freed and the houses burned, of Olvir's grateful weeping. He felt as if inside him someone whispered that if he took the bargain, the measure of his changed self would be hollowed out. He smiled then, small and slow, without joy. "I will not bargain for silence." Sigurvald's smile cracked into a grin that was more animal than man. "Then you have chosen a road that ends in ice and bone," he said. "We will meet again, Eric, and next time I will bring a hand that does not tremble." Eric left the tent with the heart cold and steady. Outside, the camp was a mass of men waiting with the sleep that comes from confidence. He walked back to his people with nothing but the certainty that war would return, not for glory now, but for survival. The days spun into a harsh, brittle season of raids and counter-raids. Sigurvald struck with a new ferocity, hitting supply lines, burning small shrines, killing those who would not bend. Eirik responded with the surgical care of a man who had been taught to use the sharpest of tools. He ambushed paymasters, liberated small stores, cut off messenger routes and rerouted them through secret passages. The war turned into a series of small, intense fires rather than open battlefields. Men died quietly in ditches and under trees far from the halls. There were nights his men did not return. The heart's toll showed in ways that were invisible until they were not. Eric felt his emotions flatten and slope toward a single point. Compassion became strategic. Outrage was a lever. He began to sleep less, and when he did sleep, he dreamt of faces made of ice. Once he woke with the terrible image of Thorstein's laugh, that bright, careless sound, locked in a room whose walls were closing in. One evening, after a raid that had taken a merchant's goods but spared lives, Eric sat alone beside a small private fire. Runa came and sat, her boots crunching on frozen leaves. They shared silence for a long time before she spoke. "You're not the same as when you left," she said. "Not wholly. The heart has given you sight, yes, but it has taken something else." He looked at her, eyes old and honest. "What would you have me do?" "Not to stop," she said. "You must act, but do not let the stone act through you. Remember what it is to laugh for nothing. Save something that is yours alone that the stone cannot touch." He thought of Astrid and of Haldis's boy, and of the ledger she tended by the fire. He thought of small human things that had no price, the warmth of a child's hand, the off-key song of villagers sweeping their hearths. Remembering those small things burned like prayer in his chest. "I will not let it make me less human," he said steadily. She laughed softly, and for a moment the sound was like a bell. "Do not promise what the gods will not keep," she said, "but try." The seasons turned. The snow thinned and then deepened again. Men grew lean and hard. Sigurvald's raids grew bolder, and the cost of resistance piled like winter wood. The heart's cold comfort was never enough for what he had to do, but it was a tool, and he used it as a man uses an axe, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with blunt force. The war entered its final season in the month when the moon hung low and fat like a coin about to be weighed. Sigurvald had gathered a force to march upon Hrafnhall and end the matter in a blow. Men had been paid and threatened and promised things they could not refuse. The skies were the colour of old lead. Even the ravens seemed to ride the air more slowly, as if their wings were tired. Eric saw the plan in the map the heart made for him. The main road would be lined with Sigurvald's troops. The hall would be blockaded with a ring of fire and spears. The trick, always, was to find the single point where the plan cracked. He found it in a small ford, the route Sigurvald's troops would take to cut off reinforcements. It was a narrow, muddy squeeze that would make large numbers useless. He gathered his best men, Bjorn, Runa, Halvard, Jarn, a few chosen others, and they moved in the night with the kind of quiet the poor learn from stealing bread. The attack was swift, a blade that slid into flesh and left no room for second thoughts. They opened the pass, did what needed to be done, and the day of the final assault on Hrafnhall dawned with the chance of victory balanced like a bowl. The clash was brutal and consummate. Swords screamed, banners were torn, men bled and fell, and the world narrowed down to the sound of breath and the stomp of boot against churned earth. Eric moved like a man given advantage by both skill and by an unworldly seeing. He predicted arcs and pivoted out of knives and took life with a precision that left him surprised. He kept thinking of Runa's words, "Remember small things." When the final moment came, with Sigurvald's standard faltering and the traitor himself face down in the dirt, bloody and panting, Eric stood above him. Blood ran from a cut on Sigurvald's brow, and his breath came like an animal's frantic pant. He could have ended it, a single swing, and the war would be over. His men's cheers would rise, the Jarl's hall would be secure, and he could return to being a man with a blue silver in his eye who'd fixed a wrong. But the heart hummed a different vibration. It showed him not only the kill, but the after, the way that executing Sigurvald in the dust would harden those who watched into a new kind of fear, the way Sigurvald dying would create a martyr in the mouths of those who loved him, the way the Jarl, humiliated further, might crown a new cruelty. The stone's knowledge was wide and sometimes terrifyingly humane in its calculation. Eric looked down at the man who had betrayed him, his brother in oath who had been swallowed by ambition, and he felt an old and complicated sorrow. He did not feel pity in the soft sense. What he felt was the weight of consequence. The choice he made would be a rune he carved into the history of men. He sheathed his sword. Sigurvald spat blood and laughed a cracked, ugly sound. "You are weak," he said. "You were never the man your old songs made you to be." Eric looked up at the faces in the field, at the villagers who had fought, and at the men who had followed him into snow and shadow. He thought of Thorsten, and of the boys freed by Halvard, of Haldis's son clinging to his cloak. He felt, then and clearly, that whatever he did must be a stitch rather than a blade. The heart had given him seeing. He would use it not to end, but to shape the way forward. "Go home," he said to Sigurvald, voice low and steady. "Leave these lands and keep your deeds to the south. Swear you will never again seek to bind the people with fear." Sigurvald's face contorted. For a heartbeat he seemed ready to bite the hand that offered such mercy. Then he rose slowly and spat in the dirt. "I will not take exile," he said. "I will return. The land belongs to the strong." "You choose exile or death," Eric said. "And know this, if you ever return to these parts with soldiers or with treachery, I will find you. I will not need the heart to show me where your bones lie." Sigurvald's eyes burned. He was a man who had not yet learned humility. He laughed then, a hard, bitter sound, and got to his feet. He turned and fled with a handful of men, leaving behind his standard, his ring, and the smell of burned oil. Men shouted after him, but the traitor's shadow lengthened and was swallowed by the woods. Eric watched him go. He did not feel triumph. He felt exhaustion and a faint, fierce sorrow. The war was not ended. The man he had been once, a straightforward thing who struck and was done, might have killed Sigurvald and ended the cycle. But Eric had learned that killing often cinched the loom in worse ways. He had chosen a different stitch. The village cheered, and some sang. Men embraced. Astrid walked to him, her face wet with soot and tears, and took his hand. They held each other in the middle of the field, amid the rubble and the trampled snow. The heart's glow was a dull and steady stone in his chest. It hummed approval, but less like gloating and more like a metronome. Eric's victory was not the end, but a hinge. The war had cost much. Men had died, barns were burned, and the land kept its scars. But the balance had shifted. The Jarl's rule had been chastened, and the people had tasted the power of speech and public proof. Sigurvald fled into a world where the southern Jarl would not coddle him forever. There his wounds would be tended, and his pride nursed until it might again become a threat, or until he learned that he could not buy his way from the debt of 1,000 small cruelties. That night, by the fire, Eric considered the ledger the heart required. It had given him sight and had asked payment. He had given some things, friends whose lives would not be holy as they were, nights of dreaming in which faces became icicles, but he had not become a monster. He had tried to wield the stone with Humina's hands. Runa sat beside him, her arm bandaged, but healing. "You did not kill him," she said softly. "No," Eric answered. "Perhaps I chose a different kind of justice." She smiled then, small and sharp. "We will have to live with the consequences. Both choices leave a mark." He thought of the island where he had found the heart, of the way the temple had pulsed, and the spirits had whispered that power is paid in blood. He wondered how many more payments would be required, and whether the ledger would ever be balanced. He was certain only of one thing. The heart had changed the terms of his life. It had given him sight. He had used it to stitch a fragile piece from ragged threads. The future would demand more choices. Above them, the aurora waned and the stars returned to their thin, indifferent watching. Men moved among the fires, talking and tending wounds. Eric felt the small warmth of being for a moment a man among men again. He rose and walked to the edge of the field, where a small child chased a dog and did not yet know the world's bargains. He watched the dog bound and the boy laugh, and for a fraction of a second, a thin, delicate shard of eternity, he felt the weight of his power melt into something softer. "Keep the ledger," he whispered into the night, and for once the heart's thrum was a quiet answered echo rather than a roar. The price was yet to come, but for now the world had a fragile place to sleep. The months that followed Sigurvald's flight were an exercise in fragile governance. Eric discovered that removing a tyrant does not remake a country overnight. Power is like a river that scours new channels whenever the old bed is blocked. The water finds another way. Men who had been gently pushed aside by a hall's favouritism now pressed to fill the hollow left by the toppled order. The Jarl, humiliated and chastened, attempted reforms that read like petitions in the mouths of men who had never had to ask. Promises were made and sometimes kept. New ledgers were kept in public view, and Eric added his oath as a witness. People came to him with petty grievances and great ones. The heart showed him where truth might be hidden and where resentment festered. It was careful work, and it bored him much of the time. Not because the task was small, far from it, but because it required a tedious human kind of patience. He had thought the heart's sight would make everything jauntily simple. Find the lyre, cut the rope, return the goods. Instead, the stone revealed layers. A merchant's lie that had fed an orphan's food, a bailiff's theft that had paid a midwife's cure. The world was a woven thing, its corruption sewn into the stitches of survival. To cut a thread cleanly often left someone's cloak threadbare. Astrid became his partner in this administration not merely in affection but in craft. She learned to temper public justice with private mercy. When Eric's sight discovered a taxman who had kept more than he should, Astrid sat with him in the cold and asked about his children. When a trader's accounts were false, they did not always hang him. Sometimes they restructured his debts and set a schedule. Eric did not relish this compromise. He had always been a man who thought in terms of blows and blood. The ledger, by contrast, required ink and tolerance. People began to set a different measure of worth by the steadiness of the new ledgers. The Jarl's men grumbled, and Zigravald's allies in the south gritted teeth at every public accounting. In the villages, however, the measure took hold. Men who could show the truth of their dealings began to prosper again. That slow prosperity was a kind of revenge, Eric realized. Not the savage sort, but a steadier, lasting one. It would outlive songs. Sigurvald, however, sharpened himself into a longer game. Exile had not been a punishment to him. It had been a workshop. He bided his time in the south beneath Jarl Vaemund's banner, licking wounds and learning commerce, not merely war. Sigvald was clever in ways that were not always admirable. He could buy the loyalty of a Lord Steward with a promise, and buy the steward's cowardice with a chest of silver. Vaemund, for his part, was glad to gain a man who knew the north, the roots, the thin places where men's loyalties could be coaxed. Eric watched the south's movements as the heart allowed, not because he wanted to spy, but because he understood the simple, devastating fact of retaliation. It is always cheaper for the aggressor. The south had men and coin. The north had pride and bone. The winter's bite deepened once more. Food was tight. The land had barely recovered from the first season of raids. Sigurvald's men made strikes along the coasts. Small, fast, aimed to starve rather than conquer. A granary here, a stable there. Small torches set to idle winter stores. A band of men taken in the night to serve as labourers in the south. The strategy was to make living under Eric's protection intolerable. If men lost the choice to keep their barns, their loyalty would be a brittle thing. It was in one of those nights, when the sky was a single low iron sheet, and the stars had been drowned, that Runa did not return from patrol. She had gone with a small party to check the southern roads. She had been cautious and precise, the sort of sentinel who had saved more than one life by thinking a step ahead. Their trail, found at dawn, showed the struggle, scuffle marks and clotted blood, footed prints leading into woods that smelled of smoke. A search turned up a rag, her woven kerchief snagged on a thorn bush. Beyond that, only silence. They hunted for days. Men followed the tracks until their boots ached. Dogs gave up the scent when the trail crossed a river. Then, 2 nights later, Runa's body was found at the edge of a ravine, hidden beneath a covering of boughs and dragged shallowly into the snow, her throat slit with the deliberate hand of a man who wanted no clamour. Her face was placid, as though she had drifted in sleep. Eric cradled her as though she were a child and cursed the cold, with a sound that was half prayer and half thunder. For the first time since the heart had marked him, he felt the stone pulse with a current that was akin to grief, not the distant compassion he had learned to calculate, but a raw, burning hunger for answer. Runa had been one of the first to pledge to him in the early cold nights, the one who had laughed in the face of an icy dawn when even the ravens seemed sentimental. Her death carved a hole that the ledger could not account for. They took her back to the village and laid her in the hall. People came in silence and placed small gifts at her feet, a length of rope, a bead, a bit of bread. Astrid stood at the head and kept watch while tears froze on her cheeks. Bjorn struck his chest with the flat of his hand and howled like a wolf. Men wept, men cursed, men swore vengeance that sounded for a while like a chorus. Eric stood above the body and listened. The heart told him what it could. A pattern of footsteps, the glint of a type of blade, a tone of voice a witness might have heard and then frozen. Small things that amounted to an outline but not a name. It showed him a road to the south and a shadow that moved like a man. But the stone did not tell him everything, or perhaps it told much but demanded something in return. He had learned to read those demands. Power asks for a tally. Each use of the heart's sight left a small mark within him, an aching, like a fresh bruise. For small fines, a hidden ledger, an adulterer's truth, The bruise was tiny. For Runa's death, the bruise grew to a throb that made his head ring. He could, he knew, chase the shadow down into the south and pull forth the men who had killed her. The heart's sight could follow and unmask like sunlight on a thief. But to use it like that would likely require him to unmask many things. Names of those who had been bribed, lists of payments that implicated men who would rather see Runa's death unavenged than watch their own secrets spilled. Eric sat by Runa's bier and considered the balance. He remembered the spirits in Frostheim, their hollow whisper that power is paid in blood. Runa's blood had already been spent. If he used the heart to find the killers and to pull them out across the roofs of houses, he would bring retribution, swift and perhaps necessary, and he would also, most certainly, ignite a war that would lay open every wound the ledger had closed. Men would be exposed and perhaps hanged, and the thin peace would fray into ruin. Astrid came and knelt beside him, her mittened hand on his. "Find them," she urged softly, voice like coal. "Find who did this and make them answer. You have the sight." He looked into her eyes and saw a hunger easier to read than any signet. The desire to see the man who had struck that blow and to put his blade through him was an animal inside her as it was inside Eric. He believed then, as a man can only believe when only a small number of choices remain visible, that this thing was as much about meaning as about revenge. If he did not find whomever killed Runa, he would never move out of that place of grief. He would be a man haunted, anchored to the same grief, a ghost that moved among the living. So he used the heart. He set men in motion like pieces around a board. He let the stone prick his mind and point at roads, at a small band of mercenaries who had been seen in the edges of the south, men who smelled of Veemund's coin. He sent riders with rations and false pretexts to those towns, and watched as local troublemakers were quietly questioned. A small name rose up in the murmurs, a captain called Edric, a brutal man who made a business of night raids. The hunt took them far south into marshes of wind and dark, into a foreign clan's lands where the dialect was rough and the ale thicker. It took weeks. Men followed the trail through villages, through taverns, through smoke. The heart was not a map that pointed a single arrow. It wavered like a candle in wind. Still, every small hint, every stray scrap of cloth drew them nearer. At last, on a night soaked with rain, they found Edric's holdfast. The man was less polished than Sigurvald. He had the blunt brutality of hired hands and the hollow eyes of someone who had never learned to be kind. The party that guarded him was larger than Eric had hoped and smaller than he feared. They had the look of men who had done poorly and had thus learned to be cruel. Eric and his men struck. The battle was brief. The shock of steel in darkness was a lesson in efficient brutality. Edric's men fell, some pleading, some cursing. Edric himself tried to run but was caught between Eric and Bjorn, a man who had been a helmsman and who now used the same steady hands to close a throttled neck. Edric's eyes widened as he saw the blue in Eric's left eye flare in the rain. Perhaps the sight was at once a sermon and a threat. They brought Edric to Runa's hall where the bodies of the fallen had lain. The captain's resistance had been a thing of muscle and will, but his spirit crumpled when he saw Runa's flat face. He looked small in the glow of the torches. "You killed her," Eric said simply. Edric spat blood and laughed, then cursed. "I killed many," he said. "I was paid." "By whom?" Eric demanded. Edric's eyes darted. Fear carved new channels on his face. For a moment he looked like a trapped animal. Then, in the bitterest of breaths, he said, "Veemund, and a man who calls himself Sigurvald." It was the confirmation Eric had wanted, and the condemnation he had feared. He had used the heart, and it had answered. The chain of command ran back south, and an old rival had set the chain in motion. Eric felt the cold ring of duty in his chest tighten. The path forward was clear in one way and dark in another. For justice, for war. They put Edric to the question, not for sport, but for truth. The man broke like a thin twig. Under the pain and the knowledge of betrayal he named more names. A steward in Veemund's hall, a ship captain who carried cratefuls of men for coin, a list of rendezvous. It was a map of commerce and cruelty. When the news reached Jarl Veemund, who had no love for Sigurvald outside of what he had purchased. The southern Jarl made his calculations. Publicly he pleaded ignorance. Privately he scowled and tightened his purse strings. The consequences were inevitable and immediate. War. Sigurvald had forced the hand he'd hoped to avoid by provoking reprisals. Eric's hunt had forced the south into the open. The winter war that followed was a different instrument from the earlier skirmishes. This was a conflict between juries of men who had been bought and the men who would no longer be bought. It was a grinding contest of supply lines and controlling small harbours, of making the winters unbearable where your enemies fed. Sigurvald, clever and desperate, matched each loss with a blow that made the land bleed. In one raid, Eric lost men he had not expected to lose. A coastal hamlet that had agreed to hide a convoy was betrayed, and the raiders came at dawn with the southern brand on their cloaks. Men leapt from houses, swords drawn, but the surprise was total and cruel. Halvard died that day, a young thing with an old man's courage, surprised by the edge of a spear while trying to push a child into a boat. Bjorn sustained injuries that left him walking with a limp and a temper that would not calm. Eric cradled Halvard's body as he would have cradled Runa's and felt the ledger of the island tick its slow account. Every use of the heart had yielded victory, but each victory had a count, a life, an oath, a laugh taken. He began to understand the bleak arithmetic the spectres had hinted at in Frostheim. The more you see, the more the world expects you to pay. At Halvard's funeral, Astrid sang a song her mother had taught her, a soft, ancient thing about the sea-taking men, and about the living making small altars of memory. Eric listened, and the heart throbbed in sympathy and in warning. He felt older than he had expected to be. He felt like a man stretched thin between duty and the loss of those who made him human. He had a choice then, a brutal, lucid one. He could press forward into a war that would cleanse Sigurvald's influence from the north at the cost of more lives, perhaps entire winters, or he could step back, cede the south a narrow band of influence, and force a negotiated peace that might leave Sigurvald wounded but alive and dangerous to the future. He chose neither rashly nor with the blind diplomacy Sigurvald had offered. He chose instead a third way, to take the war to the south in a surgical fashion, to strike at the infrastructure that supported Sigurvald's hires, the ships that carried men, the stewards who took coins and ordered raids, the black market ports where men were sold. If he could find and cut the arteries of Sigurvald's supply, the man would shrink into a brigand rather than the lord he sought to be. It was a plan that would demand knights on the sea, men who could navigate unknown harbours, and favours from old contacts. Eric also knew the plan demanded a higher personal cost. He would have to use the heart deeper than ever, to trace not merely patterns but secrets well ensconced. He steeled himself. He would pay, as the island had warned him, but he had chosen the payment's aim. They struck like a shadow at 3 coastal depots where Sigurvald's merchant ships were being loaded. The raids were swift, quiet, taking crews and burning ropes. On the last night, as Eric watched flames slip the dark like fish scales, a messenger found him with a single line of ink. Sigurvald returns. He brings Vaemund's men, and a new iron that eats shields. Eric folded the paper and breathed the cold night in. The ledger of winter had been written in sacrifices and cunning. He stood ready at the edge of a field where the aurora shimmered like a thin wound of hope. The coming season would demand more than the sharpness of a blade. It would require the kind of stubborn mercy he had learned to practice. The heart pulsed like an impatient drum. As dawn crept over the ridge, Eric stowed his sword and walked into the hall. Men greeted him as if he were both a man and a law. Children pressed close, and for an instant the world was precisely as it should be, a hall full and warm and safe. But with the paper in his hands and the knowledge of Vaemund's new iron, he also felt the long, cold path bending into a horizon that promised battle and bargain, blood and ledger, and decisions that would cost more than he had yet ever counted. He set his jaw and looked to Astrid, who had come to stand by his side. She laid her hand on his forearm and did not ask what he would choose. She trusted that he would use the sight for a wise end. Eirik returned the trust with a look that said he would do his best to keep the tally even. They would go south when the snows allowed, and when the traders' routes did not freeze. They would cut the supply lines. They would force Sigurvald into a place where either he would be a killed man or a broken one. The heart hummed with approval, and a deeper note that might have been pity. The winter closed around them like a hand, and the country braced. The ledger of winter had been thickened by loss and mended by small mercies. Eric walked among people who had both loved and cursed him. He understood with an aching certainty that the price of sight had not been merely the lives it cost or the odd sleepless nights. It had been the slow diminishment of simple pleasures, the kind wonder at a child's laughter, the ability to wake without counting the bodies of the lost. Power had turned him into a man of measures. It had given him a way to save his people, and had also made him accountable for every life that resulted from his choices. He would keep counting, and the ledger would keep its book. But at the edge of that accounting, like a single stubborn rune, sat the memory of Runa and Halvard, and every man whose name he had carved in the frost. They would be his compass. He used the heart to see, not only to unmask enemies, but to find the narrowest way between justice and ruin. The south would come with iron. He had a winter and a plan. The next pages of the ledger would be written in storms, in cunning, and in the quiet refrain of a man who had learned that the true price of sight is not what you get for yourself, but what you refuse to take from others. And somewhere, under a sky that would not yet relent, Sigurvald gathered recruits and swore that the north would yet bend. The wolf and the traitor were moving closer to a final inevitable crossing. Winter had settled like a grey stone over the northern lands. The rivers froze into long silver ribbons, forests sagged under frost, and the wind cut across the plains like a scythe. In Hrafnhall the people worked with the steady rhythm of survival, chopping wood, hauling stores, tending animals, mending roofs. The fires in the hall burned longer, casting a golden glow on the carved beams. Yet under the surface of domestic calm, Eric felt the tension in his chest, a weight more enduring than any snowstorm. Sigurvald had not been idle. The southern Jarl, Vaemund, had gathered a force that by spring would reach the northern borders in strength unmatched since the first raids. The heart's glow was a dull blue in his chest as he walked the halls, watching the young boys learning to wield swords, the women managing accounts and supplies, and the men maintaining drills. Each life in the hall seemed a fragile gift, a flame that might be snuffed by the coming storm. Eric's mind traced the map again. Rivers, passes, forests, supply routes. He could see every patrol, every potential ambush, every hidden cache that could give Sigurvald's forces an advantage. The gift of foresight weighed heavy. It demanded decisions, not only of war but of mercy and justice. Astrid approached, her arms carrying a bundle of scrolls. Her hair was brushed back, streaked with frost from her morning duties. "They report that scouts have seen Sigurvald's men near the coast," she said. Her voice was calm, but Eric sensed the tension under her words. "How many?" he asked. "Enough to strike fear into men who haven't been tested," she said. She laid the scrolls on the table. "And yet there are gaps in their supply lines. You've seen them?" He nodded. "I know where they will move. I can predict their routes, but not the heart of Sigurvald. He is clever. He will force us to act before we are ready." Astrid's eyes softened. "Then act, Eric. We have been ready long enough." The decision crystallized. They would strike south before the southern forces fully consolidated. Eric's men were few compared to Sigurvald's numbers, but they were skilled, loyal, and guided by knowledge of the land. They would fight like the wind and vanish like smoke, leaving destruction and confusion in their wake. But beyond the tactical strikes, Eric knew there was a reckoning waiting, a confrontation with Sigurvald that would not merely be blood and steel, but the test of their wills and their shared histories. The march south. The night they departed, the moon hung thin and pale in the sky. Eirik Bjorn, Halvard's replacement, a young warrior named Leif, and a small contingent of men departed in silence. The snow crunched softly under their boots as they moved through forests, across frozen rivers, and along the edges of cliffs where the wind threatened to throw them into icy depths. Each step was calculated, each movement precise. Eric's calm was born of the heart's guidance, but also from a deep understanding that misstep meant death. Their first strike was at a small port where Sigvald's hired captains had been gathering mercenary sailors. The operation was swift. Eirik's men moved like shadows, cutting ropes, burning supply ships, and capturing a handful of men alive to interrogate. The captives revealed the broader plan. Sigvald intended to secure the northern fjords before spring, cutting off any chance of reinforcement from Hrafnhall. He was ruthless, as predicted, but not flawless. Eirik's strikes had already forced him to adapt. They continued south in a series of raids, sabotaging food depots, burning ships, and cutting lines of communication. The southern forces were spread thin, reacting to each strike with confusion, while Eric's men moved like a phantom army. Yet each victory carried a cost. Men fell, not in battle alone, but to frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. Each life lost left a bruise on Eric's soul. The heart pulsed with a quiet note of warning. The more he used it, the heavier the toll on his humanity. The confrontation. It was on the 7th week of their campaign that Eric finally came upon Sigurvald's main encampment, nestled in a shallow valley guarded by woods and a winding river. The heart's glow throbbed in his chest as he surveyed the encampment. He could see the traitor moving among his troops, issuing commands with the arrogance that had first drawn Eirik's hatred. Around him men drilled, laughed, or ate by the fires. Sigurvald seemed oblivious to the careful, hidden eyes that studied him from the ridge above. Eric's first instinct was to strike immediately, yet he remembered Runa's death, Halvard's fall, and the lessons learned from past mercy. He chose patience. They would wait for Sigurvald to make the first error, and as dawn approached, the frost on the valley floor glittered like shards of glass, the wind carrying the faintest smell of wood smoke and blood. The first movement came from Sigurvald's men themselves, a group of southern scouts, overconfident and unaware of hidden northern paths, strayed too close to a narrow gorge. Eirik struck. His men descended like wolves, cutting off the group and forcing their surrender. They interrogated the prisoners and learned of Sigurvald's larger plan, a frontal assault on Hrafnhall, using the fjords as a naval route to land troops directly behind the hall's defences. The revelation hardened Eric's resolve. They would strike tonight. The northern army, though small, was disciplined and patient. Using knowledge gleaned from the heart, they moved like ghosts, planting traps, setting fires, and drawing Sigurvald's troops into confusion. Each manoeuvre was designed to weaken the southern forces without unnecessary loss of northern lives. As the Battle of Fjord's Edge dawn found the armies facing one another along the frozen fjord. Sigurvald had fewer men than anticipated, many disheartened by the losses inflicted by Eirik's raids. Yet they fought with a vicious determination, knowing retreat would brand them as cowards. The battle was brutal and swift. Eric's men used terrain to their advantage, frozen rivers to funnel enemies into choke points, forests for ambushes, and snowdrifts for cover. Arrows rained from hidden positions, and men in the front lines were cut down before they could fully advance. Sigurvald's southern forces, trained for conventional warfare, faltered against the unconventional tactics. In the midst of battle, Eirik finally confronted Sigurvald. The two men met in the snow, steel flashing under the pale morning light. Sigurvald's eyes burned with hatred, his grin cruel and sharp. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," he spat. "I am inevitable." Eric's sword met Sigurvald's, ringing with the sound of iron against iron. The fight was intense, both men skilled, both tempered by years of conflict and hardship. Every strike was measured, every parry a test of will. Sigurvald fought like a man without conscience, relying on speed and brutality. Eirik relied on precision and foresight, guided by the heart but anchored in humanity. They clashed again and again, sparks flying, boots sliding in icy snow. Eric's mind raced not only with tactics but with memories. The deaths of Runa and Halvard, the loyalty of his men, the trust of Astrid, and the survival of his people. He realized that this was not merely a duel of blades, but a duel of futures. Finally, with a decisive maneuver, Eric disarmed Sigurvald, sending the traitor's sword clattering across the frozen ground. He held his own sword at Sigurvald's throat. The battlefield fell silent as the southern soldiers watched their leader humbled. "You have failed," Eric said, voice calm, carrying over the snow. "Not just your men, not just your schemes. You have failed yourself." Sigurvald spat, blood mingling with frost, and laughed bitterly. "Do it then. End me." Eric looked around at the southern soldiers, their faces wide with fear and uncertainty. He saw the potential for endless cycles of vengeance if he killed Sigurvald here. He thought of Runa's wisdom, of mercy, and of the possibility to shape a different future. "You will live," Eric said, "but you will not rule here again. You will leave these lands, and if you return with malice I will find you, and then there will be no mercy." Sigurvald, defeated, was taken under guard, humiliated and broken, and escorted south. The remaining southern forces dispersed, many deserting once they realized the strength and determination of the northern army. Aftermath and legacy. With Sigurvald gone, Hrafnhall and the surrounding lands settled into a long, cautious peace. Eric returned to the hall, where the people celebrated the survival of their home. The cost had been great. Men lost, villages burned, and lives forever altered. Yet the northern lands were free from immediate threat, and the ledger of winter, as Eric called it, was balanced once more. Eric himself had changed. The heart remained in his chest, a constant pulse of awareness, but he had learned its limits. Power, he understood, was not merely the ability to see and act. It was the restraint to choose wisely, to weigh mercy and justice, to protect what was precious without becoming the instrument of cruelty. He walked the halls with Astrid at his side, teaching children the ways of survival, the importance of loyalty, and the subtle lessons of justice. Men trained under his guidance, not as soldiers alone, but as stewards of the land, aware that their strength was meaningful only when tempered with wisdom. In the spring, when the snow thawed and rivers swelled with meltwater, the people rebuilt their homes and farms, the fjords once again filled with the hum of life, fishermen rowing their boats, traders arriving with goods, children running along paths newly cleared of ice. The scars of war remained, but they became part of the story, reminders of resilience, of courage, and of the price of sight and foresight. Eric often walked alone at dawn, gazing over the hills, remembering Runa and Halvard, Torsten and the boys freed from danger, and the countless men and women whose lives had been touched by the conflict. He carried the heart with care, aware that each choice it guided would exact a toll. And yet he also knew that through it he had learned the true measure of a man, not how many he could kill or control, but how many he could save without losing himself. Years later, songs would be sung of Eric the Watcher, the man who bore the blue heart and shaped the winter ledger with a steady hand. Not for the wars alone, nor for the victories against Sigurvald, but for the wisdom to temper justice with mercy and strength with humanity. The northern lands thrived, shaped not by tyrants, but by men who understood the true cost of power and the enduring value of life, loyalty, and honour. And so Eric's story, the tale of betrayal, survival, and the price of extraordinary sight, became legend. A story not of unending conquest, but of the delicate balance between wrath and compassion, a testament to the idea that the greatest victories are those that preserve not only life, but the soul. The ledger of winter, thick with sacrifice and cunning, remained as a silent witness to the choices of one man. And beneath the northern skies, the aurora shimmered like a reminder. Even in darkness, light can guide the way, and the true measure of a hero is not in blood spilled, but in the lives preserved through courage, wisdom, and restraint.